Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for coming. Oversight is a critical function and a constitutional responsibility of our branch. Every year, this committee tries to invite the Secretary of Homeland Security to brief us on the state of affairs at that department. It's an opportunity to question the administration's policies, as well as an opportunity for the department to take responsibility for its actions. It's a pleasure to have Secretary Johnson here. This is the first opportunity for our committee to question him publicly since the President's executive action on immigration announced November. Even though there is an injunction against the executive's actions, we can still get a good idea of what to expect from the enjoined programs based on the way the department has implemented the DACA program. It appears, for example, that applications for deferred action are being rubber stamped, evidenced by the fact that criminals and gang members are receiving special benefit despite supposed policies against it. Take, for example, the case of a DACA recipient, North Carolina, Emmanuel Rangel Hernandez, who's accused of murdering 4 people. Last week, the department admitted Rangel Hernandez had received DACA despite his gang membership, which was known to adjudicators, and despite being in deportation proceedings. The agency response indicated a lapse in the processing of Rangel Hernandez's application. However, it's not yet clear who ultimately made the decision to approve the application, but we need to get to the bottom of it. We know that the agency has terminated 282 DACA requests because of gang and/or criminal issues, so this appears to be a bigger problem. This tragedy compels the question, what background checks are in place and are they adequate to ensure benefits are not being provided to those who pose a threat to homeland and public safety? And does this administration truly have a zero-tolerance policy for granting immigration benefits to criminals and gang members as suggested by the President? The committee will also want to hear from the Secretary about the proposed expansion of DACA and why the department provided over 100,000 DACA work authorization extensions despite assurances its lawyers gave the federal court that it would not implement any aspect of the President's executive action until February 18th, 2015. Whether discussing the 2012 DACA program or the 2014 executive actions, there remains questions about the legality of the President's action. There are also questions about how the department will fund the program and whether illegal immigrants will suffer due to the prioritization for benefits of the people in the country illegally. The Secretary must also answer as to why this administration is allowing people here illegally to be put on the path to citizenship, which is clearly a constitutional responsibility of Congress. This path to citizenship is afforded through the administration's use of advanced parole, which they are encouraging DACA applicants to take advantage of. This loophole will set a dangerous precedent that will allow lawbreakers to obtain the benefits of lawful permanent residence and citizenship after showing a total disregard for American law. One thing seems to be very clear. There's little will or desire by the administration to enforce the laws on the books and back up agents in the field who swear to uphold the law. The administration needs to answer for the release of criminal aliens into the community. In fiscal year 2013, the department released from detention over 36,000 convicted criminal aliens in removal proceedings or after they had been ordered removed. Then in 2014, it released 30,558 convicted criminal aliens. They had convictions ranging from homicide, sexual assault, to kidnapping, to aggravated assault, to drunk driving. According to ICE statistics, 56.8% of the 30,558 releases in 2014 were purely discretionary. The remainder were due to court mandates and the ability to obtain travel documents. Why did the administration release almost 60% of the criminals in their custody, and what are they going to do about it? I expect the Secretary to address that today. I expect the Secretary to also address the problems with the EB-5 Immigrant Investor Program. Not only are these they're gaping holes that risk our national security, there are serious management problems that were highlighted by the Inspector General. The IG laid out how preferential treatment was granted to those well-connected. It is very clear that the Secretary does not plan to hold the former director, who now sits in the number 2 post, accountable for his actions. Instead, it appears that the violations of ethical conduct will go unpunished, all while agents and adjudicators in the field are being reprimanded and threatened if they don't get to yes and follow the president's policies. I'd also like to hear Secretary Johnson's thoughts on combating an array of national security issues that the country faces. The rise of ISA, of course, presents a significant threat to the homeland. This past weekend, it was reported that the federal government is actively investigating an ISA plot to commit a terrorist attack inside the United States, perhaps by targeting uniformed personnel in California. The Transportation Secretary had TSA alerted local law enforcement to be on the lookout and to increase security. Earlier this month, there were a number of arrests of American citizens for their involvement with ISA. The Justice Department has also alleged that ISIS helped to train a man from Ohio. The man had traveled to Syria, was directed to return to the United States and commit a terrorist attack here. Other individuals, including a Kansas man and 2 people in New York, were allegedly inspired by ISIS propaganda. And numerous other Americans have been arrested on the way to the airport as allegedly attempting to travel to ISIS. The president has downplayed the threat posed by ISIS, but it reportedly has billions of dollars, controls significant territory, and is executing innocent men, women, and children across the Middle East, including Americans. It's obviously a threat that requires a serious and sustained response to keep our homeland safe. Another threat I expect the Secretary to address is ever-increasing risks of cyber attacks. News reports are filled with shocking examples of the federal government's lack of preparedness against the threat. It was reported this past weekend that the president's unclassified email was hacked late 2014. Defense Secretary Carter recently disclosed that earlier this year, Russian hackers accessed an unclassified Pentagon computer network. Moreover, a recent Government Accountability Office report found that DHS lacked a strategy for protecting government buildings and access control systems from intrusion by hackers. Cybersecurity can't be on the periphery of our national security strategy any longer. It has to be at the center. There are many issues to discuss today, and I thank the Secretary for being here. And I'm told that Senator Leahy cannot come, and I'm willing to call on anybody on that side of the aisle. Go ahead, Senator Schumer.
Thank you for choosing me among all the other choices first. I appreciate that very much. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Johnson. Secretary, it's always a pleasure to see you and speak with you about the critical issues confronting our nation. As a fellow New Yorker, I'm proud of the work you have done since being confirmed. I think most Americans join me. You've done a great job, and I think I can speak for our friends on both sides of the aisle. You're always available. You're always candid. You ask the right questions. You give answers when we answer questions, so you're a credit to your department and to the country, and your depth and breadth in counterterrorism and defense issues has served the department very well. And I want to tell you, you have a great staff. They hear from me constantly. New York's a center, a terrorist target. New York, we have all of these Sandy issues and defense issues. and your staff is fabulous, so I thank you for that. We all know that DHS is tasked with an enormous range of responsibilities, from guarding our borders and coastline to administering immigration, responding when disaster strikes, shielding the president, protecting our airports, securing the homeland. It's a huge job. In my state, from New York to Buffalo, New York City to Buffalo, and all along the northern border, the department's work directly impacts our economy as well as our security. Whether it's the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, the JFK International Airport, Hurricane Sandy relief efforts, DHS's work is vital to New Yorkers, and your dedicated civil servants who fill these responsibilities are essential. Unfortunately, we had an appropriations battle where we fought from the beginning of the year, and we emphasized time and time again that 90% of DHS personnel would be declared essential in the event of a department-wide shutdown. That meant they'd have to work without pay unless Congress got its act together. It befuddled me how so many people could want to hold up DHS funding when you have so many vital issues at stake unrelated to immigration because the president wouldn't do what it wanted. It was hostage-taking at its worst, and I'm glad the department didn't shut down. I'm relieved, too, that you were able to keep your hands on the helm during those difficult times. So I want to close by addressing two issues that my dear colleague, Senator Grassley, has addressed. First is ISIS and terrorism. There are new terrorist threats, believe me. As a New Yorker who lived through 9/11, knew people who died, I know that. But I would say this to my colleagues. With the new threats and the changing threats, we ought to be taking our hat off to the Secretary, his people, and all the people in the CIA, DOD, NSA who do an amazing job. It's not an accident that, praise God, we have not had a 9/11-like incident in America. In fact, just about every, with the exception of Boston, which was unique, just about every major terrorist incident has been thwarted ahead of time, as Senator Grassley talked about. That's not an accident. That is not an accident. And I think that the men and women who work for you, CIA, DOD, NSA, and all the other agencies, FBI, deserve a tremendous amount of credit. They are wonderful. They're like our soldiers. They are wonderful civil servants who are, I've talked to so many of them, who are truly dedicated to preventing, God forbid, another terrorist attack on our homeland. So I salute them, and certainly questions should be asked, but let's not forget to give a little praise where praise is due. Second, on immigration. You know, I find it truly befuddling about my colleagues from the other side of the aisle. They cry out against a broken border. Well, the bipartisan immigration bill passed, Senator McCain and myself, the Gang of Eight, does more to tighten up the border than any proposal made by the other side. More than any. We talk about a broken system, but our colleagues are just happy to let the status quo go on, where employers are allowed to hire new illegals. Our bill stopped that with things taken from Jeff Sessions' book, E-Verify, and things like that. So we get a lot of complaints that the president's moving forward on immigration, but we have no activity, no solutions from the other side of the aisle. Only complaints. That's not governing. Now they're in the majority. They have a responsibility to start governing on this issue instead of just complaining when the administration, because of the paralysis in Congress on this issue, not caused by Democrats, blocks us from moving forward. So I would just say you'll hear a lot of those complaints, but let us all bear in mind that this Senate, bipartisan, came together on a solution that dealt with border, dealt with illegals crossing the border, dealt with all of the issues we faced. It had overwhelming support in the country. A majority of Republicans supported the bill. But because of a hard right few, we've been unable to pass a bill. And that should be constantly borne in mind as you will hear the criticisms that you will hear today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.
Thank you.
I mean the microphone, not on the floor.
Before I have you go ahead, stay seated, but I'd like to have you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God.
I do, sir.
Thank you. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the members of the committee for hearing me today. You have my prepared statement. Let me just say a few things in the 5 minutes that I have. In my view, counterterrorism needs to remain the cornerstone of the Department of Homeland Security's mission. It's the reason we were formed, and it's the reason why I accepted service as the Secretary for this department. In my view, the global terrorist threat has evolved to a new phase. It is more complex, it is more decentralized. In many respects, it is harder to detect. There are more groups, and we therefore need a whole-of-government approach to our counterterrorism efforts that includes, very much so, the Department of Homeland Security. We have the phenomenon now of foreign fighters who leave their home countries, go to places like Iraq and Syria, and return. We need to track foreign fighters. We need to track foreign fighters from countries for which we do not require a visa. My staff is developing, as a follow-on to what we did last summer, greater security measures that can be taken with regard to travelers from those countries. We continue to focus on aviation security. I want to build pre-clearance capability on the front end of a flight into the United States, and we're working daily to do that. A lot of our efforts continue to center around airport security. We directed a number of things last week concerning airport security. We are engaging state and local law enforcement, which in my view, given the nature of the homeland threat, which involves the threat of the lone wolf, the independent actor, it's much more important that we work with city police departments, commissioners, state law enforcement as well. We have our engagements in the community to counter violent extremism. I've personally traveled to places like Minneapolis, Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, to engage community leaders about countering violent extremism. I'm pleased that the Congress is active in evaluating and voting on cybersecurity legislation. It's one of my top priorities, and I'm happy to discuss that further. We are doing a lot to enhance border security. We have added resources stemming from last summer. We have prioritized those apprehended at the border. We have developed what I briefed to some of you, the Southern Border Campaign Strategy, which is a DHS-wide combined effort at border security on the southern border. As I reported last week, our numbers of apprehensions on the southern border midway through the fiscal year are down considerably from where they were this time last year and even the year before that. Apprehensions are an indication of total attempts to cross the border illegally, and they are down considerably, though I believe that there is more we can and should do. As all of you know, the President and I are interested in reforming our immigration system. We announced a number of executive actions that include deferred action for parents, which is the subject of the litigation in Texas, but it includes a number of other things as well. Added border security, the Southern Border Campaign Strategy, pay reform for immigration enforcement personnel, and so forth. We are ending the controversial Secure Communities program, which led to a lot of resistance from state and local law enforcement in an effort to get at the criminals who should be removed from our country. I'm interested in enhancing public safety. I'm interested in getting at the criminals, and so we are working with mayors, governors, county commissioners, sheriff's chiefs to introduce them to our new priority enforcement program so that they will work with us again in an effort to get at the criminals who should be removed from this country. I'm sure we will have an opportunity to discuss the EB-5 program. There are a number of security enhancements I'd like to see for the EB-5 program. I wrote a letter to the chairman and the ranking on that yesterday. We're doing a number of things to reform the way we manage the department to make it a more effective and efficient place. Last but not least, I want to thank the members of the Senate for helping us fill the vacancies in our department. Over the last 16 months, we've had 12 Senate-confirmed presidential appointments to the department, including myself. Our nominee for Undersecretary for Management, Russ Dio, was confirmed 2 weeks ago. I'm very appreciative of the Senate for that. and our nominee to be the new TSA administrator should be announced shortly, perhaps even today. So I thank the committee in advance for your time and attention, and I'm interested in building a more effective and efficient Department of Homeland Security, and I appreciate the support in doing that.
I'm going to start with a statement on Mr. Mayorkas that I don't expect you to respond to, but I want you to know exactly how I feel about it. The Inspector General report on Mr. Mayorkas and the EB-5 program, the Inspector General clearly laid out the evidence against Mayorkas. The report explains how he intervened on 3 particular cases, each of which had high-profile political connections. Despite the outrage, it seems to me that you have no intention of doing anything and plan to stick by Mr. Mayorkas, even though he provided preferential treatment and violated the very rules he wrote about ethical conduct. It's no wonder that there's a morale problem at the department. Employees see leadership getting away with violating the rules. Employees are given clear rules on preferential treatment and how to adjudicate EB-5. Yet when the director himself breaks those rules, there's no recourse, and then what are employees to think about that? The only defense that I've seen so far on the preferential treatment is the agency gets pressure from members of Congress and from both sides of the aisle. I think that that's comparing apples and oranges, and it's no excuse. Members of Congress aren't in a position to affect final decisions like a director. So, Secretary Johnson, I think that it causes a loss of credibility with many people that work within the department. It's a shame that there has been, it's been tolerated by you and others in the administration. That's that statement. I'll go to my first question. I want to ask you about Mr. Rangel Hernandez, a gang member that committed those murders I referred to. According to your April 17th response to me and Senator Tillis, Mr. Rangel Hernandez's application should have gone through several layers of review, including by U.S. Citizenship Immigration Services background check unit. Because of his gang affiliation, the department's headquarters should also have reviewed the case. Thus, the adjudicator would only be able to approve such an application after a sign-off from Washington leadership. There was obviously a lapse, but it's unclear who dropped the ball. First question, why was Mr. Rangel Hernandez approved for deferred action despite his known gang ties? In other words, which office is responsible for approving the DACA applicant, and was it the adjudicator, the background check unit, or USCIS headquarters?
Senator, the answer to the why question
Microphone.
The answer to the why question is simply he should not have received DACA. I believe on balance DACA is a good program. I also believe that this case is a tragic case, and this individual should not have received DACA. I cannot state that in stronger terms. In reaction to that case, as I think you know, we've gone back and we've retrained the entire workforce that deals with these cases to make sure that they identify trouble signs such as suspected membership in criminal gangs. If you're a member of a criminal gang, a known member of a criminal gang, you should not be receiving DACA. You should be considered a priority for removal. So we retrained the force, and we've done a retrospective review of every DACA case, every DACA participant, to see whether there are any similar to this case. We've identified some, and we continue to evaluate this to make sure that we've reduced situations like this to zero in the DACA program. I'm interested in deporting criminals, sir, and that's one of the reasons why we have engaged in things like Operation Crosscheck, which is interior enforcement. This was an operation conducted several weeks ago where we rounded up some 2,000 priorities for removal. So I'm interested in getting at the criminals, sir. But this case is a tragic case, and he should not have received DACA.
Do you know whether it was the adjudicator or the background check unit or the USCIS headquarters that made the mistake on Hernandez?
I believe that the error occurred, and I don't have the facts in detail, but I believe the error occurred once he was referred to those who normally conduct the background checks. I don't know the name of that unit, but I believe the error occurred at that point.
Okay, and then you just talked about a zero tolerance policy, and I guess it would appear to me that you don't have a zero tolerance policy, and you just told me you do have. So I guess in the future, then, we would expect things like this not to happen.
Well, in the future, I am interested in deporting criminals, including those who've committed crimes who are in the DACA program. They are priorities for removal.
On April the 9th, and all this question is can I have a response by May the 1st? On April the 9th, I wrote you about another individual, I think it's pronounced Jose Borroquez, in the country illegally, and alleged a DACA recipient that has been charged with suspicion of second-degree murder in Tempe, Arizona. I have yet to receive a response, and could you see that I get a response to that?
I will undertake to provide you a prompt response, sir.
Thank you. It's clear to me that the department no longer seems to have a will to enforce immigration laws, and I start with the statistics: interior removals plummeting from 237,000 fiscal year 2009 to 102,000 fiscal year 2014, saying that officers were reassigned from the interior to the border. I don't think, well, I guess I'd say a red herring. It doesn't explain why interior removals had already declined by 44% between 2009 and fiscal 2013, well above the surge. What can the committee expect with regard to removals in the interior? Will they continue to decline, showing a continued disregard for enforcement of the law?
With the resources we have, sir, I'm interested in focusing on criminals and recent illegal arrivals at the border. So we've prioritized criminals, we've prioritized those who came into this country after January 1, 2014, and we've prioritized those who are apprehended at the border. And so that is one of the reasons why we have a new priority enforcement program where we want to work with law enforcement to get at those who are behind bars. It's one of the reasons why we have developed Operation Crosscheck, greater interior enforcement against criminals. So I'm interested in going after the criminals. One of the reasons I believe that the removal numbers are down this year, and we are in the middle of the fiscal year, is because lower apprehensions. So there's lower intake, lower apprehensions, as I referred to in my opening remarks. There are fewer people attempting to cross the southern border, and there are fewer people apprehended. The other reason, frankly, is because of all of the resistance that we were receiving in state and local law enforcement to the Secure Communities program. Something like 239 jurisdictions were resisting cooperating with us in our enforcement activities. So we've developed a new program that I believe removes the political and legal controversy with the old program. And I am now personally engaging in conversations with mayors, governors, about the new program so that we can work together again at interior enforcement against criminals, those who represent public safety. I also believe, sir, that one of the reasons the numbers are not as high as they used to be when it comes to removals is because of the changing character of the migrants. They are increasingly from non-contiguous countries, and the process of a removal of someone from a non-contiguous country is more time-consuming. You see greater claims for humanitarian relief, for asylum, and So it's not as simple as just sending somebody back across the border.
Senator Klobuchar.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Senator Grassley, and thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I know we've talked about this in the last week, and you're very aware of what's happened in Minnesota, where 6 men from the Twin Cities area were arrested for plotting to travel to the Middle East to fight for ISIS. Our U.S. attorney there, as you know, is doing a good job, as are our law enforcement officers on the federal level, your people. And I think you also know that one of the reasons we're able to make these cases is because of the relationship that law enforcement has built over the years with the Somali community, of which we're very proud, and been able to get information and be able to bring these cases. And I think that gets forgotten sometimes. And part of this is the effort that you mentioned. You're coming to Minnesota. I was with you then. And the idea of fighting extremism and the pilot program that's going on in Minnesota. And I would hope that this is a long-term priority of the Department of Homeland Security. And one of the concerns that we have about the current state of the program is that the grant programs that support the extremism initiatives are not sufficiently focused on helping the programs in the pilot cities. And you mentioned the pilot cities. And I was wondering if we can get some more funding, to be so blunt, given that we have shown we are actually having these problems. This pilot has been recognized. We did just get $100,000 from the Justice Department, but it's kind of hard to add to everything else we're doing with the prosecutions, and that's what we're trying to pursue in the Twin Cities right now.
Senator, I agree wholeheartedly that our so-called CVE engagements are fundamental to our overall Homeland Security counterterrorism efforts, which is why I'm spending a lot of my personal time doing it myself. So, as you know, I came to Minneapolis some months ago. I think it is important that we engage communities, community leaders, the Islamic community in this country. And I believe that through the good works of people like your U.S. Attorney, Andy Lugar, there's been a lot of progress made in building trust between community leaders, family members, and law enforcement, even federal law enforcement. So when I go to these communities myself, I recognize it's an exercise in building trust. So they want to talk to me about profiling at the airports or some of their issues with how we enforce our immigration laws. And I want to listen, I want to learn from those experiences, but then I always have an ask, as you know, which is that it's everybody's Homeland Security, it's your public safety, it's your Homeland Security, and help us with public safety.
Okay, and I want to move on to something else, but I do, again, want to put that pitch in. In the past, when I was law enforcement and pilot programs were set up, it usually came with some kind of funding that would support the kinds of goals of the program. So
yes.
I think that's very important if we want to show that this works. Second thing on U.S. Customs and Border Protection is, you know, one of their key responsibilities is enforcing our trade laws, including the anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. Particularly important in the Iron Range of Minnesota, we've had 1,100 workers laid off. This is true to my heart. This is where my grandpa worked, where my dad grew up. My grandpa worked 1,500 feet underground in the mines his whole life. And it appears that we could be doing more just based on talking to the White House, talking to people with various departments with U.S. Customs to be checking these shipments when they come on our shore. If they're filled with illegal steel products, why can't we see it and call it as it is? And I think that sends just as strong a message as changing statutes, which is very important to make it easier to bring these cases. But I'd like to stop these things from getting on our land to begin with if they're not supposed to be there. So could you talk about the efforts that are going on with that right now?
Part of what our mission is promoting lawful trade and travel and combating customs fraud, illegal dumping, as you referred to it. And so our CBP personnel, as well as Homeland Security investigations, are spending a lot of time dealing with fraud in connection with our imports, exports, false statements, counterfeit items. I think HSI in particular does a pretty good job when it comes to tracking inappropriate, illegal shipments of things. And we're also focused, frankly, on promoting lawful trade and travel. And we've had record numbers of imports, inspections last year in that regard. But our efforts need to be focused on the items you referred to as well, sir.
Right, and we're going to be pursuing this as we move along in the next month or so. But to me, this could get a lot of bang for the buck if we did a better job enforcing the laws right when the shipments come in. And it just seems to me it's pretty easy to find a bunch of steel rebar when we're able to find drugs in smaller containers of things. If you got a whole shipment of steel, there's got to be a way to see it and track it and figure it out. And I think it would be a very smart way of enforcing these laws. Last thing I wanted to ask about was the U visas for victims of domestic violence and trafficking. I know you're supportive of comprehensive immigration reform, and we worked on this as part of the bill that passed the Senate. But on the first day of the fiscal year, USCIS filled its limit of 10,000 visas. The Vermont Service Center, as an example, is now processing U visa applications filed in March of 2014 that will not leave the waiting list until fiscal year 2018. What are the ramifications of running out of these victim visas so early?
Well, the ramifications, if demand exceeds supply, obviously, is that a lot of people worthy of U visas don't get them. And so I appreciate the efforts that were undertaken in the comprehensive Senate bill to address this issue, and I hope we can readdress it at some point. Yes,
and again, I know this isn't your issue from a policy standpoint because you're supportive, but I think it's important for my colleagues to know that as my experience as a prosecutor was that people would deliberately prey on people and then tell them to shut up after they raped them because they were going to report them. And that's why this U visa program has been so successful to get people to come forward who are victims, who have documentation issues. So I'm hoping that we will be able to resolve this and going forward when we do pass some kind of comprehensive immigration reform bill. But I think people have to know the nationwide numbers and what's happening. So thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership. And Secretary, good to have you with us. Well, first of all, on the comprehensive immigration bill, it was not supported by the people. And over a 10-year period, the number of green cards would increase from lawfully then 10 million people getting permanent residence to 30 million people getting permanent residence. And as to the enforcement situation, Senator Grassley offered a bill that said, well, we want to see the border secure for 6 months before the amnesty occurs. That was rejected by the Democratic majority in the Senate. Senator Cornyn had a bill that would call for a commission to certify and improve the border situation using governors and others. That was rejected. And so that's part of the reason we had such a difficult time. Secretary Johnson, I believe Senator Grassley is correct to say that we see a lack of will in your department and before you took the office and from the president, frankly, on down. He mentioned interior enforcement. 40% of the people here unlawfully today came lawfully and refused to leave on time. We have no real ability to deal with that and have not taken steps required by law to deal with that. From the first day the president took office, he stopped worksite inspections and basically threatened agents never again to do that. He canceled and effectively ended the 287G program that welcomes state officers to be trained by the federal officers to help them improve their situations and their ability to help. The sanctuary cities continue unabated. They don't even honor your detainers. Won't even honor your detainers, and we need to, why we would not push back against that, utilizing financial incentives, I don't know. Operation Streamline that worked in a number of border sectors has been cut back dramatically, if not ended. True interior removals are much lower than they have been. The president's push for amnesty, his continual discussion of it, his promise of amnesty, and he's actually carrying out executive amnesty after Congress refused, has increased immigration unlawfully into the country. We've continued to allow foreign countries to refuse to accept back people that we are trying to deport. If they don't accept that, then they shouldn't have other members, other citizens admitted here. Morale in your department is the lowest in the government. Indeed, they even filed a lawsuit against your predecessor because the department was blocking them from carrying out plain law. Deportations are down 41% over 3 years, 25% over last year. 160,000 criminal aliens are on the streets. And now you've announced a program to fly people from Central American countries who apply for refugee and parole status in those countries to the United States of America at the expense of the U.S. taxpayers. All this has led, I believe, millions to conclude if they come here illegally, they'll be successful. And we've got to change that fundamentally. And if you do that, I believe we can make progress. And in fact, I would note that you've gotten a good bit more resources, although Border Patrol numbers are beginning to slip again. And in fiscal year 2006, before the first big battle over amnesty occurred, there were 12,000 agents. Now there are 21,000 agents, although they've declined for the last 3 years, Border Patrol agents. So I don't, just can't say, Mr. Secretary, that you have led, and the President and your predecessors have led effectively, demonstrating a will to do what the American people want, which is a lawful system of immigration that serves the national interest, one that we can be proud of. We're not there yet, and you need to do more. And you can do more with the resources you have. And if you need more resources and legal changes, please let us know, and I think Congress will respond. Let me ask you this, just some fundamental questions. How many aliens with final orders of removal are currently in the United States and have not been removed?
I don't have the number sitting here right now. I'm sure it is a large number by your measure and mine, and it's an unacceptable number. But I know that there is a huge backlog in our immigration enforcement efforts. We need to prioritize those, in my judgment, who are public safety threats in this tremendous backlog, and those who have come to this country illegal recently, which is why in the new priorities we've put an emphasis on those who arrived here after January 1, 2014. So that going forward,
with regard to your priority, I understand you need to prioritize. I can understand that. But a priority can become in itself an amnesty. A priority can say huge numbers of people are not going to be deported. What I hear you saying, and I think others could hear you saying, that if you don't commit a serious crime, you're okay. You're not going to be deported. Let me ask you this. According to the Border Patrol statistics, in fiscal year 2014, 479,000 individuals were apprehended at the southwest border.
Yes.
How many of those remain currently in the United States?
A lot have been removed. A lot were sent back on an expedited basis last year. But as I said a moment ago, a number of those are from non-contiguous countries, and they've asserted claims.
So that is a problem. I think we need to help you pass laws that would make that easier. But how many of those easier to remove? But how many of those are actually here, having been released on bail, have not been deported, and have gone someplace throughout the country? Do you not have the numbers?
Well, let me say two things. One, when we had the spike last summer in the Rio Grande Valley, we expedited the return flights to Central America. We reduced the turnaround time from something like 30 days down to 4 days. And we surge resources. And so we turned them around quicker, and we've kept the resources on the southern border.
Well, I'm going to
so
submit a
that
written question. My
the
time's
numbers
up.
remain low.
I'll submit a written question, but I think you need to be able to tell us how many of those have actually not been deported but have successfully entered the country through that illegal process.
Senator, that's a knowable number, and I'm happy to provide it to you. I just don't have it sitting here.
Thank you.
Secretary Johnson, thanks for your leadership at the Department of Homeland Security. You have a tough job. Unfortunately, Congress hasn't made it any easier for you. My friend and colleague from Alabama said, what America wants is a lawful system of immigration. Couldn't agree with him more. Lawful. Would that suggest that Congress should pass a law? Well, wouldn't that be novel? We did pass a law in the Senate, 68-32 Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act, and the House of Representatives refused to call it up or anything since. So if we're going to have a lawful system of immigration, perhaps we should have a law from Congress, which has been opposed by most of the critics that you're hearing today. What the president has tried to do is to step in with a broken immigration system and make it better. I don't know how anyone can argue that we are a more secure homeland if we don't know who's living here. And what the president has said is that if you are a young person brought here through no fault of your own and have grown up in this country, through DACA, we'll give you a chance on a temporary, renewable basis to submit yourself to a criminal background check and to live in America without fear of deportation. Temporary, renewable process, criminal background check. Seems to me that's not only fair, but makes our country more secure. And when Congress failed to pass a comprehensive immigration law, the president said, of the 10 or 11 million undocumented in this country, we are better off as a nation to know who they are, where they live, that they've submitted themselves to a criminal background check, and that they're going to pay their taxes while we're here. I think most Americans would agree that makes us a more secure nation. But there are people who just loathe this notion that the president would use his power as an executive, as other presidents before him, to try to make this a more secure nation. I have a special interest in DACA. Introduced the DREAM Act 14 years ago. Hearings in this committee, called before Congress as part of comprehensive immigration, passed. But sadly, the House of Representatives refused to even consider the issue. I'm concerned of reports that say that more than 11,000 Dreamers who applied to renew DACA in a timely manner have lost their status because of delays in processing at your agency through no fault of their own. So can you tell me what the status is on applications for renewal on DACA, Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir. We, as I'm sure you know, encourage DACA participants, if they're renewing, to do that months in advance of when their current authorization expires. You're correct that a number were not issued their work authorizations in time. I think you're right that the number's about 11,000. Most who renewed timely and were able to get their work authorizations on time. I also know from the director of CIS that we've set up a hotline, so to speak, for expedited treatment if somebody is facing the lapse of their work authorization and they haven't got a new one in time, and that if that process is utilized, we will do our best to try to turn that around in a timely manner, making sure that we've appropriately assessed the renewal application. But I do know there is an expedited route to get a work authorization before it lapses if people know about it and they take advantage of it.
I thank you for that. And as you might imagine, I joined a number of senators encouraging the president to create the DACA program. My understanding is some 600,000 have successfully applied for that protective status on a temporary renewable basis and submitted themselves to criminal background checks. And I've met many of them, and they're getting on with their lives and on the path to making a great contribution to this country. It would certainly be helpful with our broken immigration system if Congress stepped up to its responsibility too, and that we did something to enact the law which would make us a more secure nation. When it comes to our border, we not only have invested more resources in protecting the border of the United States with Mexico than ever in our history. It's one of the largest federal law enforcement agencies that we have in this country. And the comprehensive immigration reform, which many on the other side voted against, would have dramatically increased that. technology, and manpower to protect the border. In your opening statement, you talked about a decline in apprehensions at the border. Could you repeat that for the record and suggest what that says about what we're doing at our border?
I think we have invested, well, I believe that our investment in border security over the last 10, 15 years is showing results. We have more people, more technology on the southern border in particular now than in the history of this nation. And I think that it is showing results. In the year 2000, there were 1.6 million apprehensions on the southern border. That number in recent years has ranged somewhere between 350,000 to, as Senator Sessions noted, 479,000 last year. That increase last year was due almost majority to the spike in the Rio Grande Valley sector. I expect that the number will be down considerably from 479,000. But longer term, our investment in border security is showing good results. I believe that the downturn in the numbers is due to that. I believe it's due to the fact that we got the word out in Central America that there are no permisos like the coyotes were spinning last summer. You can see our public awareness campaigns posted at bus stops in Guatemala City, for example. I believe that our law enforcement efforts against the smugglers are showing good results. And all of this is in the face of an improving economy in this country. Normally, illegal migration is tied to the economic conditions in this country. We have an improving economy. So the pull factors are there, but we are seeing a pretty marked decrease in apprehensions this fiscal year. I looked at the April numbers this morning, and the April numbers are pretty much consistent with the March numbers.
I just have a few seconds.
Sure.
I want to close by saying that I believe that when we are judged in the course of history on an international basis, the world will point to the humanitarian crisis in Syria and ask every civilized nation on earth, what did you do? Some nations have made an extraordinary sacrifice. Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan have accepted huge numbers of refugees, and we've helped pay for their care. The United States in the last 4 years has accepted 700 refugees from Syria. We can do more. We should do more. And I hope that there is an effort afoot in your agency to find ways to safely bring in those refugees who are no threat to the United States, but represent a true humanitarian challenge to our country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your service. I'd like to address two different topics. I want to start with an issue you raised, which is ISIS and foreign fighters. To the best of DHS's knowledge, about how many Americans have traveled abroad to join up with ISIS?
Senator, the way we calculate that is there are approximately, and this is the last time I looked, it could be a little higher now, 180 individuals who have left to join the conflict in Syria and Iraq or attempted to leave. That number, as I said, is probably a little higher by now, but that's the number we've said publicly, and I think that that's a fairly accurate number. There's an unknown factor, clearly, sir.
So, but on the order of magnitude, 180 is a good approximation.
The last time I saw a number, it was about that, but it's probably higher by now.
Chairman Grassley and I have joined together in introducing legislation, the Expatriate Terrorist Act, that provides that an American citizen who travels abroad and joins ISIS and joins up with a foreign terrorist organization has in so doing constructively forfeited his or her American citizenship. There's existing legislation on the book that provides for other grounds for forfeiting your citizenship, but right now, joining a foreign terrorist organization is not one of those. In your judgment, would it be beneficial to have additional tools to prevent U.S. citizens from using American passports to come back to this country and potentially wage jihad and attempt to murder American citizens here at home?
Senator, I don't know that stripping somebody of their American citizenship is is the most effective tool. I do believe that we need to enhance our efforts to interdict those who were attempting to leave the country and prosecute them for material support, or deny them boarding on the return flight, or in some way investigate and apprehend them before they can get on the flight or once they return. And we have spent a lot of time with our counterterrorism partners overseas and within the Department of Homeland Security at better efforts to detect those who are engaging in travel to Iraq and Syria, including broken travel. And so we spend a lot of time in DHS and with law enforcement doing exactly that.
Although I guess the track record of apprehending people when they're coming back is not what it should be. If I recall correctly, the elder Zarnaf brother who carried out the Boston bombing, when he came back to America, his return and his travel was not flagged, although it was supposed to be. Is that correct?
Very clearly, there were some lessons learned from that case, and we've done, I believe, a better job at connecting the dots in reaction to that case.
Well, let's shift to a different topic, which is the enforcement of the border. I am very concerned by the lack of enforcement at the border, the lack of enforcement of our immigration laws. And I'm very concerned on multiple levels. Number one, from a perspective of national security and dangerous illegal immigrants being allowed to come into this country. And number two, from the perspective of this administration not enforcing the law. Now, last week, the Washington Times ran an article, the headline of which was, "Illegal immigrant deportations plummet as amnesty hampers removal efforts." And it described that this year, deportations have fallen by another 25% this year. And indeed, overall, deportations of those who are here illegally are down 41% from 3 years ago. And indeed, the article goes on to say, and the drop began almost exactly at the beginning of President Obama's illegal amnesty. Mr. Secretary, how do you explain a 41% drop in removals of aliens here illegally?
A couple of things, sir. One, the apprehensions are in fact lower on the southern border, so the intake is lower this fiscal year in particular. Two, secure communities. Secure Communities was a controversial program that led to the enactment of restrictions, prohibitions on cooperating with our immigration enforcement personnel in a number of different state and local municipalities, so forth. Secure Communities was becoming so controversial that mayors, governors were passing laws, ordinances that prevented cooperating with us in our enforcement efforts. And so we've ended the Secure Communities program, as I mentioned, and put in its place a new program that I believe will promote enforcement so that we can get at the criminals. But Secure Communities, in my judgment, is one of the reasons why we're seeing
Mr.
those
Secretary,
lower numbers, along with a few other things, sir.
You stated your interest just a moment ago at getting at the criminals, which
Yes.
I guess is very much the same as the President's purported justification for his illegal amnesty program, that it would allow the focus of prosecutorial resources on violent criminals. It strikes me there's a fairly serious problem with that argument, which is namely that the department is not focusing its resources on violent criminals. Indeed, the number of criminal aliens deported from the interior has declined 23% since last year and declined 39% since the peak in 2011. So when it comes to violent criminals, the department is not stepping up its efforts, and indeed, if you look to 2013, in 2013, the department released 36,007 criminal aliens with serious convictions. That included 116 with convictions for homicide, 43 with convictions for negligent manslaughter, 14 with convictions for voluntary manslaughter, 1 with a conviction for something ICE classified as, quote, homicide, willful, kill public official gun. and that individual was released. In addition to that, you had 15,635 criminal aliens who had been convicted of drunk driving that were released back into the population, 2,691 who had convictions for assault that were released into the population. Why is the department releasing so many criminal aliens? And secondly, can you tell this committee in the 6.5 years of the Obama administration's tenure just how many criminal aliens have been released, how many murderers, how many rapists, how many people who have been convicted of violent assault have been released into the population?
Yes. As you pointed out, Senator, in fiscal year 13, there were about 36,000 individuals convicted of a crime who, once in our immigration system, were bonded out. That number declined to about 30,000 in fiscal year 14, but in my judgment, that number is still too high. So in reaction to this situation, I directed that we do a number of things differently, including elevating the approval for a circumstance where somebody who's been convicted of a crime is released from immigration detention. It is the case that some of these cases are due to releases by immigration judges or by the Supreme Court jurisprudence in Zavadas versus Davis. But I do think we could do a better job, which is why I've directed we elevate the approval level for that, and that we no longer release people for lack of space. That was an issue in FY13, especially when we were dealing with sequestration. We had a situation where we released a lot of people because we were concerned we didn't have the space, and I've directed that that should not be an excuse for releasing somebody. We should find the space. And so this is a problem I recognize exists, and I'm interested in promoting public safety, and that's why I've directed these changes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I'll follow up with a written request for the information I asked for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin this morning, I think it's important to acknowledge the events taking place in Baltimore right now. My heart goes out to the family of Freddie Gray and to the city of Baltimore. I understand that the events surrounding the death of Mr. Gray are now the subject of an independent investigation, and I believe that a full and thorough accounting of the facts is a necessary first step in helping to restore trust between police officers and the community. But as we wait for the results of that investigation, and as we all work together to secure justice for Mr. Gray and his family, I join Mr. Gray's family in urging all the protesters or those who do protest to do so peacefully. Secretary Johnson, cooperation between law enforcement officers and the communities they serve remains the focus of national attention, and it seems that everyone agrees that racial and ethnic profiling undermines trust in the authorities, that it causes resentment among targeted groups. I was pleased to see former Attorney General Holders. I got to start saying that now. Revisit DOJ's policies on profiling and extend the ban on profiling to cover gender, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I think this is a step in the right direction, but these new guidelines do not apply to the TSA or Customs and Border Protection, which are DHS agencies. These agencies are still permitted to use profiling when screening airline passengers and individuals crossing borders. I understand that it is challenging to ensure public safety while simultaneously building trust with communities who have experienced profiling. Minnesota, as you know, has a large community of Somali Minnesotans, Somali Americans, for example, and I want to thank you for traveling to Minneapolis last year and meeting with members of the Cedar Riverside community to hear their concerns. But I continue to hear from members of the community report that they experience profiling and who are singled out for additional screening and questioning at the St. Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport so routinely that they prefer to drive to Chicago, over 400 miles away, rather than fly out of their hometown. And instead of fostering respect and cooperation, I worry that our current practices are nurturing fear and resentment. I'd like to know what steps, in your view, DHS can take to ensure that we do a better job of protecting our security while simultaneously respecting the dignities of those that are new to our communities.
Thank you for that question, Senator. First of all, we looked pretty hard at whether we could sign on to the DOJ non-profiling policy last year or earlier this year. We found that given our different missions, that policy, which was intended for law enforcement, didn't quite fit, because we have, as you pointed out, aviation security, border security,
I understand.
administration of our immigration laws. There is a general rule that we should not engage in racial profiling. That is still the case. That was the case before. That's the case now. Nationality, given the nature of our mission, is taken into account, for example. I have heard, just as you have heard from the Somali community in Minneapolis, that because of the profiling that they perceive occurs at the Minneapolis airport, they prefer to go to Chicago. I've heard the exact same thing. I asked TSA to undertake an evaluation and a study of that. They have come back to those in the community to address the concerns. I think it, frankly, continues to be a work in progress, but TSA knows my view that we should not profile at airports, and we should not make it the case that somebody prefer to go to Chicago versus Minneapolis, their own airport. And we've had, I think, some productive conversations with the community along these lines, but I think it also probably continues to be a work in progress, and it's something that's on my radar personally.
Thank you for that response. I understand that last night a court issued a decision that needs to be evaluated regarding families in immigration detention facilities, but I'd like to talk about that issue nonetheless. In the past few years, the Department of Homeland Security has significantly increased its use of family detention centers at an annual cost of nearly $2 billion. Family detention centers often separate parents from their children, and their recent expansion has led to complaints of poor conditions, inadequate services, and physical dangers for those detained. Such allegations would suggest that family detention centers pose long-term developmental challenges for immigrant children and families. What is your view of the current family detention system? Should the use of family detention facilities be expanded or reduced in the future?
Before we encountered the situation we had in the Rio Grande Valley last summer, we had, among the 34,000 beds for immigration detention, only 95 for family units, for members of families. And so in the face of what we were dealing with last summer, which included a lot of families, we expanded our detention space beyond 95, and we've opened several new facilities, which I believe are important to maintain. I've personally visited several of them to ensure myself that the conditions of confinement are appropriate. I know that the very purpose of family unit space is to keep families together so that you're not sending the parent in one direction and a child in another. The very purpose of it is to keep the families together. As you point out, there's a case or two involving family detention, one in California, one in Washington, D.C. And as recently as yesterday and Friday, I continue to evaluate whether our current policy is the appropriate one for family units. I'm hearing a fair amount about issues with family detention, and so I'm currently evaluating whether the current policy is the best one. I'm pleased that the numbers of family units crossing our border illegally is down considerably from last year, and I want to continue to evaluate it and make sure we're getting it right, because I hear the issues being raised by a number of people.
Thank you, and I'll ask further questions for the record, or I'll submit them, rather.
Good morning, Secretary Johnson. The chairman said you have a very difficult job, and I think that's an understatement. But notwithstanding the difficulties of the job, either that you have or that we have, all of us must be held accountable for the way we discharge our responsibilities. That's what this hearing is about. But it's particularly difficult to be effective when the administration continues to sabotage its own efforts by embracing unconstitutional policies like the president's executive action. 22 times the president of the United States said he didn't have the authority to do what he did. And now we have, of course, as you know, a preliminary injunction in place issued by a federal district judge in Brownsville. Obviously, the stay is on appeal to the Fifth Circuit. But I'd like to just refresh your memory and ours of what the court said when it issued the preliminary injunction. So this court finds that DAPA, that's the name given to the program, the executive action, the court finds that DAPA does not simply constitute inadequate enforcement, it is an announced program of non-enforcement of the laws that contradicts Congress's statutory goals. DAPA does not represent mere inadequacy. It is complete abdication. The Department of Homeland Security does have discretion in the manner in which it chooses to fulfill the expressed will of Congress. It cannot, however, enact a program whereby it not only ignores the dictates of Congress, but actively acts to thwart them. The court went on further and said the Department of Homeland Security Secretary is not just rewriting the laws, he is creating them from scratch. Finally, Judge Hainan said that the Department of Homeland Security does not seek compliance with federal law in any form, but instead establishes a pathway for noncompliance and completely abandons entire sections of this country's immigration law. Close quote. I know you disagree with Judge Hainan, and the courts will finally decide the propriety of his judgment. And of course, this is going to take some time, I would imagine, given the fact that he's only issued a preliminary injunction and the trial on the merits still remains. And this could go back and forth to the United States Supreme Court a couple of times before it's over with. But to me, beyond the unconstitutional act by the administration in issuing this executive action, I agree with Judge Hainan's characterization. That won't surprise you. I think perhaps the larger tragedy is that the president has poisoned the well in Congress and destroyed any trust whatsoever between the executive branch and the Congress when it comes to fixing our broken immigration system. And I know our friends who were on the Gang of Eight, Senator Schumer, Senator Durbin, said they have an answer. If the House would simply just swallow whole hog the Gang of Eight bill, all the problems would go away. Well, the Constitution gives the House authority to agree or not agree. And one thing I think we should have learned from this whole exercise is that comprehensive immigration reform does not work. That's what I've learned in the last 10 years working to try to fix our broken immigration system. So we need to do what we can where we can, and I still have not given up hope that we can do that. But I will say the president's executive action poisoned the well and made the congressional branch, the legislative branch, so distrustful of the president's actions that it's going to be very, very hard, much harder than if the president had not undertaken this action. So I'd like to ask you, do you regret the actions that you and the administration have taken that have gotten us to this point?
No, I do not, Senator. I believe that the undocumented population in this country, which at least half of which has been here more than 10 years, has to be reckoned with. We know they're here. and they are not priorities for removal. I would note that in two places, Judge Haenen's opinion refers to the fact that the Secretary he acknowledges, has the authority and the discretion to engage in prosecutorial discretion, prioritize who we should remove and who we should not. There are millions of people in this country who are not priorities for removal. There are dozens of states that allow them to have driver's licenses. There's one state that says that an undocumented immigrant has the right to practice law. So, in my judgment, we have to deal with this population. You refer to the fact that the president supposedly poisoned the well. We took the action we took after waiting literally for years for Congress to act. So
do you think it's an excuse for the president to act unconstitutionally because Congress doesn't act quickly enough to suit him?
I have what is, in my judgment as a lawyer, a very, very thoughtful opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel that we have the legal discretion to do what we did. Unfortunately, Judge Haenen disagrees, but the case is on appeal now.
And my guess is that it's going to take literally long past the time that President Obama leaves office before this matter is finally resolved by the courts, which means that not only has the president poisoned the well for any meaningful reform of our broken immigration laws during the duration of his presidency, but it also will endure beyond his presidency. I'd like to ask you in the short time remaining, you have said on numerous occasions that we have good results in terms of the number of people being detained at the border. Last year, 479,000. Don't you think it's a little premature to be declaring victory when it comes to border security? And let me ask you as well, I've always found it strange that we count success when the number of people actually detained goes down, because it strikes me that it's an equal inference that you may be doing a better job. The truth is you may not be doing as good a job and fewer people are being detained, yet you believe that represents a victory and the problem's taken care of.
Senator, I'm very definitely not declaring victory when it comes to border security. In virtually every statement I issue, like the one last week, I say, here are the numbers, but we are not declaring mission accomplished. And I refer to what more I believe we can do to strengthen border security, and that is reflected in our FY16 budget submission.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just close on this. We didn't have the time yet, but 57% of the children who came across in the wave of the humanitarian crisis last year were issued orders of removal in absentia, which means they did not show up for their court hearings, which to me means that they basically successfully navigated our broken immigration system and they're going to stay here. And that's a problem we still haven't fixed and we still need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for your service to our nation, Mr. Secretary. I am very pleased to learn that the Department is reevaluating its family detention policy. As you well know, Judge Boasberg's opinion, in my view at least, requires it. And also many have objected to family detention policies, including myself. So I'd like to work with you in devising and implementing better policy. I think that these policies can not only provide for more humane and productive treatment of young people when they come here, but also continue to have the effect of perhaps providing for fewer people actually crossing the borders. And that's been the result, I think, of some of the conscious decision-making and policy-making that the department has adopted. So I'd like to ask you what specific measures and steps you contemplate in revising the family detention policies.
Well, the family detention issue is under review in litigation in Washington, D.C. There was an injunction issued there with respect to a class of people who have made credible fear claims. And the issue in the case is whether somebody can be held as a deterrent to mass migration. And so we're looking at that case. We have a pending motion for reconsideration in the case, but I'm continually evaluating whether such a policy is necessary in the current climate. There's another case in California right now where the judge has given us 30 days to try to find an appropriate settlement. And so I'm working with the lawyers beginning this week on responding to the judge's request. But overall, I think it's important for people to know that I'm sensitive to family detention. I've personally visited Artesia, Dilley, to satisfy myself that what we're doing is the appropriate course. I believe that our expanded detention capability in the face of last year's situation was the right thing to do, and I believe that it had an influence on our overall efforts. And so I think that overall we need to maintain this capability, but I want to continually evaluate and reevaluate the policy because I hear the concerns raised by you and others, sir.
Maintaining the capability is expensive, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And detaining whole families can be a lot less humane and productive than adopting other policies. Am I right?
Detaining whole families is indeed expensive. It is a notable item in our FY16 budget request, and it can be a challenge. And so I believe that the capability is important to our overall border security efforts, but I want to make sure we have the policy right.
Let me ask you about access to legal services. Is it the policy of the department to permit and enable lawyers to visit those facilities where
Yes.
folks are detained?
Yes.
And in terms of providing counsel where private attorneys can't do so, has the department provided that kind of resource?
We do not, in immigration cases of this nature, provide counsel if one cannot be provided. We do not guarantee counsel. We do promote access to counsel, and we do a number of things to put people in touch with lawyers locally or those who are interested in representing individuals. And I know we have made improvements in those efforts since we began opening our family unit detention capability last summer.
I know that it may not be the sole responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security, but the processing of visas in Central American countries, the screening of people who want to come here has begun. Is there anything that can be done to expedite that effort? Because I think it represents a real hope for stopping the flow of unaccompanied minors and others who may come to this country and then have to be sent back.
A piece of advice that I received last summer from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is in-country screening. In other words, you can't lock the door and not provide a legal, safe pathway at the same time. And so that's what we've done in the 3 Central American countries. I'm disappointed that not more people are utilizing this, and I believe that we need to promote the new program better. I think this is a joint effort by us and the State Department and the governments in the Central American countries, but I've been disappointed that not more parents in the U.S. are utilizing this program to petition to get their kids here. So,
and I would agree very wholeheartedly, and I was surprised at a hearing that was held here just last Thursday, literally, to learn that only a small number of parents so far are taking advantage of this program, in effect, to use the rules that are available to them. They're the same rules that would apply if their children came here, but they can use them in the country of origin.
Right.
And I hope that the department will make efforts, and the State Department obviously also has a role to spread awareness about this program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service and for the service of the many men and women who serve in the Department of Homeland Security in this very diverse and difficult task that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Secretary Johnson. Thank you for being here and for your service. I know that Senator Grassley, Chair Grassley, asked questions about the Rangel Hernandez case, so I will go back to the record to see some of the specifics. I think that in your answer you did mention that there had been some retraining, revising the protocol, reviewing the protocol, revising it, and retraining so that we can avoid future instances of this what on its surface looks like negligent decision-making. But the question I had for you I have two questions. One, I believe that Mr. Rangel Hernandez's deferred status has been rescinded a month or so ago. My question is, how many other instances that have been identified in the audit or the review that were similar to Mr. Rangel Hernandez's, and what is the current status of that review and the potential that others' deferred status will also be rescinded in their disposition after that?
I know that there have been a handful of others who have been identified in the same category. I do not know the status of whether they have been rescinded or not, but we can get that information to you, sir.
Yeah, I would like to get that, and if possible, on a to the extent that the information is available geographically, what we're talking about. If I have any other instances in North Carolina, I'd like to know about it, but I'm sure the other members would like to, would be interested as well in each of their states. So I would like that, and particularly as we go through this process, for those who were granted deferred status, if there is a decision either because they've come up in the audit to continue to allow them to have the deferred status or that it's been rescinded, I'd like to get the information on both of those.
Okay, we will look at that.
Second, is there any reason why you can't say, as I said in my opening statement, that there's been 282 rescinded?
Thank you for refreshing my recollection. I believe that that is the correct number, yes.
Okay.
I think that that is the correct number.
I don't want to take time.
I apologize for not being very good.
No, Chairman, I'm glad you brought that up. The question I'd have, does that mean it's an exhaustive list, and in the opinion of the department, there is no longer any need for further review? Or are there other cases that are being reviewed that may add to that 280 or so rescinded? In other words, are there more, or have we gone back and identified potentially 280 that looked similar or had characteristics similar to Mr. Hernandez's that warranted a rescinding their deferred status? Is that done? Are we done? Or are there more to look at?
I believe that the review has been completed. I could be wrong about that, but I believe the review has been completed.
And that would just lead to my next question before I want to get on to the H-2B visa, a couple of questions that I have. I asked the same question of representatives that came from us from USCIS and the State Department last week. And that's why I think going back and confirming that these 280 are it, I'm looking to, I'm going to ask the same question of you that I asked of the two panelists last week. Can you confidently and unequivocally say that in the future the agency will not make the same errors that were made with Rangel Hernandez, and that there are not any that should be subject to rescinding, that the queue has been drained, and then the mistake that was made that allowed these folks to get deferred action will not be repeated?
I'm confident that we have improved our process so that if somebody with suspected criminal gang membership is identified in the process, it's going to be flagged and it's going to be given a lot of attention as a result of this case.
But it may or may not, affiliation with gang membership necessarily constitute a definitive reason for rescinding their deferred status?
Known membership in a criminal gang should constitute a disqualifier.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the H-2B program. Mr. Secretary, I think that the Perez versus Perez case caused a little bit of a problem, a kind of a 2-week blip that for some reason adversely affected my state. It may have affected others, particularly in the seafood processing industry. And I guess the question I have for you really relates to just wanting to go on the record. I have some things that are North Carolina specific, so I don't necessarily want to tie up the committee time with a couple of things. One would be, are there any potentially unused visas that could potentially solve some of the problem, the negative impact that's occurred in North Carolina? And if the department has any ideas on anything else that we may be able to do to relieve them. It looks like this was largely just the result of that 2-week period where visa applications were not submitted. If you're prepared to speak on it, I would appreciate to be enlightened.
Yes, Senator. I have received a lot of inquiries from Congress on H-2B visas from both sides of the aisle. After the court's injunction, we issued on a temporary basis H-2B visas. The court and the litigants agreed to a stay of the injunction so that we could do that. My understanding is that when we did that, we quickly exhausted the number, but going forward, we have just issued a new rule jointly by DHS and the Department of Labor that I believe addresses this issue and addresses the lawsuits so that we can continue going forward to issue H-2B visas.
Now, Mr. Secretary, that would apply going into next year because it's my understanding we've already hit the cap on H-2B visas for this year. So my other question, are there any other things that we could do given the unique circumstances of the blip with Perez versus Perez? Are there any things that we may be able to do to provide temporary relief until we move into next year? I mean, some have talked about the potential for temporarily increasing the cap or something else that may still, for some of these seasonal industries, still provide some relief. Has there been any discussion there, anything you'd be open to?
Well, I'd be open to a discussion about what we can do temporarily to deal with this issue. I am interested in having a more comprehensive discussion with Congress about lifting a number of caps on green cards and addressing in a more comprehensive way a number of things in which I think our immigration system needs to be fixed through legislation. And this very well could be one of them. I think that going forward, we have addressed the H-2B problem in a pretty aggressive, vigorous way.
Well, thank you. My time's expired. I would just like to state for the record, we're going to be calling you all again because I'm going to be meeting with some of the seafood processors this week. They're going to be coming up from North Carolina. I think it's the industry that's primarily been hit by the H-2B program, and in North Carolina anyway. And I'd like to speak with you all about anything that we can do to provide temporary relief and hopefully avoid it going into the out years for the program. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary. Secretary, I was shocked and appalled, we've talked about it on the phone, by the gun smuggling ring that operated out of Atlanta, Georgia, in which criminals routinely abused loopholes in the TSA system to bring loaded weapons right onto airplanes. I know you shared my outrage when it was unveiled by our DA in Brooklyn, Ken Thompson, and I applaud you for quickly acting following the incident and ordering a top-to-bottom review. Can you provide an update on security at our nation's airports, particularly the recent recommendations regarding TSA activities? What changes can we expect? How long will it take? Question one. I have a bunch of questions, so I'm trying to move through these quickly. And how will you ensure that the new, as yet unannounced TSA administrators held accountable for security at the nation's airports?
Good question. Senator, you said you appreciated my candor at these hearings. So I have made a public fact of the record number of firearms seized by TSA last year. So at screening points in carry-on luggage, you can imagine my reaction when I found out that somebody's bringing loaded weapons into the overhead compartments of commercial airplanes. And so I was, to use your words, shocked and appalled, upset, and I directed our TSA to work with the airline industry and to work with airport security authorities to tighten up our system. Our advisory committee came back with some recommendations. I have endorsed them. They include random, continuous, unpredictable screening of airline and airport security, airport employees at the sterile checkpoints. If an airline or airport employee is going to fly, they have to go through the TSA checkpoint. Continuous criminal history background checks, and reducing the number of access points. There were a number of recommendations made that I have embraced. Those are, in my judgment, the big four. I believe that our nominee for TSA administrator is an excellent choice, and I believe that he will be very focused on aviation airport security. I also believe his name will be announced sometime this afternoon.
Oh. Don't want to let us in on the secret? Okay, just one question in regard to that quick answer. Wouldn't it make sense that wherever it's feasible, in some airports it may not be, yes, that whenever possible, these employees go through a screening the way the pilots do and the flight attendants do?
You know, I asked myself that question, and I think that a one-size-fits-all approach to every airport in this country is not...
I said wherever feasible. I didn't say.
Atlanta is not Martha's Vineyard.
Right.
There are 63,000 employees at the Maynard Jackson Airport in Atlanta. That's a small city. And so I think that the appropriate, balanced way to go is random, unpredictable, continuous screening of employees when they show up. The way it works in Atlanta is there's a guardhouse at the parking lot, and you show an ID, and then you drive on through. Right. And I think that some form of continuous random screening of those people is the appropriate way to go.
Right. Okay. Now I have two questions on the northern border, separate, but I'll ask you both so I can get them in before my time runs out. One is the Peace Bridge, another issue we've talked about regularly. As my urging, Customs and Border Protection instituted pilot projects. Your predecessor was very active in helping that happen, as were you. We were thrilled to hear the results last week. The pilot projects passed CPB's test with flying colors. They said that pre-inspection on the Canadian side will reduce times and waits for commercial vehicles by as much as 75%. Will you commit to implementing the recommendations of this report and starting talks with Canada to establish permanent pre-inspection at the Peace Bridge? That's on that one. Then on the other end of our northern border, up by Plattsburgh, today I'm asking Customs and Border Patrol to start a French-speaking program for officers at the Quebec border. These officers are tasked with processing millions of French-speaking visitors. They come to New York, they spend their money, we love having them here. But because we're hampered in French-speaking, it slows the border down and we get fewer visitors. Will you commit to carefully considering my request for a task-based French language program for northern border agents, similar to the Spanish program we have over on the southern border that Jeff Flake is very familiar with? Those two questions.
Last question first.
Yep, sure.
Last question first. I am not very familiar with the Plattsburgh situation, and I will look into that, Senator, and I'm sure we will have a follow-up discussion on it. I fully support Commissioner Kurlikowski's efforts to restore and maintain pre-inspection on the Canadian side of the Peace Bridge. As you know, infrastructure, building the right infrastructure for this is probably the biggest issue, and I understand that we may have a resolution to that issue, which I think is very good.
Yeah, the Peace Bridge is willing to put in the $44 million to do it.
Money talks, yes. And I also believe that privileges and immunities, as you and I have discussed, is crucial. That is something that is important for the agreement we signed for pre-clearance with the Canadians, but I also believe legislation to implement that can be useful in the pre-inspection context.
We just need you to get an MOU moving on pre-inspection. Can you commit to getting that done as quickly as possible? I know you need the Canadians to dance with you, but they seem to be all right, given how well you did on pre-clearance.
Whatever Commissioner Kurlikowski and you have discussed and agreed to, I fully support, sir.
Excellent. Okay. Well, merci beaucoup.
Très bien.
Oh, I actually had another question, but I was so eager to say merci beaucoup, I cut myself off. So I'll add that question to the record if there's no objection, Mr. Chairman.
You can be sure there's no objection on this side. Senators Flake, Whitehouse, and Perdue.
Thank you. Tough act to follow, let me tell you. I've made my concerns regarding Operation Streamline known to the Department and to the Department of Justice. As you're aware, Operation Streamline has been a very successful zero-tolerance policy that we've had on the border, particularly in the Yuma sector. And it's most in that sector attribute the success at bringing that portion of the border under control to Operation Streamline. Yet the U.S. Attorney's Office for Arizona has ordered kind of a pullback on that policy. I just toured the border, toured Yuma and all along the border a couple of weeks ago, and there is a lot of concern there that as word filters back, that we don't have a zero-tolerance policy anymore, that we're going to start to see movement again. And there's a lot of concern in those communities along the border that we're going to see an uptick. It won't take much. As you know, word travels fast, as we learned in spades with the unaccompanied minor issue that we had. What can you tell me? Let me just ask you, do you believe that the program like Operation Streamline is an effective deterrent to border crossing?
I certainly believe that law enforcement in general is an effective deterrent to illegal border crossings. I've heard the same thing in Arizona about Operation Streamline. As you know, Senator, I've visited with a number of your constituents on the border. In my judgment, what matters when it comes to illegal migration on the southern border is that we crack down on the smugglers. And with the Department of Justice, we ratcheted up our efforts when it comes to prosecuting the coyotes last summer because of the misinformation that they were putting out. And with the Department of Justice, we've made considerable headway in the prosecution of the smuggling organizations. I believe that has contributed to our overall efforts on the southern border. I do note that the numbers overall of apprehensions are down considerably on the southern border, including in each of the Arizona sectors. So that continues to be a good thing. But I also believe that we need to continue our efforts. I think that law enforcement in general is an important part of that. Whether that should include prosecuting the illegal migrants, I think should be made on a case-by-case basis. You can't federally prosecute every single illegal migrant for a felony prosecution. I think that those judgments have to be made carefully, and they ought to be made wisely because it's a use of DOJ's resources.
Well, when you talk about going after the smugglers, the effectiveness in that program, I would submit, and those who are on the border would submit, is that it does go after the smugglers, because if the smugglers lose those who are in their charge for a week of detention, that's a big deal. And it makes them rethink and makes them direct their focus elsewhere. That's been the history, and that's why there's such concern that as word filters down that these prosecutions aren't going to happen, then we're going to lose control again, and we can't afford to do that. So are you aware of specifics of the Operation Streamline changes? Is that what it is, just case-by-case basis, and no overriding policy of zero tolerance?
I do know from people in Arizona that they think very highly of Operation Streamline, and they believe that it contributed to overall border security in Arizona. That's what they have told me. I have to assume that the U.S. Attorney in Arizona is continuing to prosecute in certain cases of illegal entry or illegal re-entry, but I don't know firsthand what the U.S. Attorney's current policy is there.
Well, I would just note that Operation Streamline was included in the 2012 to 2016 Border Patrol Strategic Plan. So it's part of your department's plan, and I would hope that we're working closely with the Department of Justice to make sure that their actions are in line with that plan. Because, like I said, in certain sectors it's had great effect, and we don't want to lose that. Let me turn quickly to an issue that Senator Grassley raised, the so-called quick trip murder detention of Mr. Alamorano. This is a man that's charged with murder. We've not yet received a response on this. As you know, he was charged, he was released. ICE failed to remove him. ICE said that he was eligible for bond at $10,000, which he posted. While out on bond, he reportedly had 2 injunctions issued against him for complaints of harassment. One woman feared for her life because he threatened to kill her, quote, plenty of times, and pointed a gun at her boyfriend. 2 years after his release, 3 days after the second injunction was issued, he was alleged to have committed this murder. Was ICE aware of these civil injunctions against this man?
I don't know whether officials at ICE were aware of the civil injunctions, but as I said earlier, Senator, that case is definitely a tragedy, and that individual should not have received DACA. He should not have been in the DACA program, and as a result of this case, we've retrained the force. We've conducted a retroactive review. I don't know the answer to your specific
Excuse
question.
me, he wasn't in DACA. This wasn't part of DACA. He was just slated for removal and then posted bond. So,
sorry. Okay.
Is that correct?
I'm sorry, Senator. I have my cases confused.
Right.
I thought you were referring to another individual.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to your specific question.
Do you have a policy where you work with local law enforcement to find out if there are any civil injunctions against individuals like this that post bond or that are out?
Well, I do know that those in removal proceedings, when they're being evaluated for release, there ought to be a background check conducted. There ought to be, and there should be, and I believe there is, an evaluation of risk of danger to the community, just like in the criminal justice system.
If there is some kind of procedure like that, it failed miserably this time. And I would just ask, if ICE had been aware that there were 2 injunctions against an individual like this, would he have, or would ICE have taken action against him to remove him?
I don't know the answer to your specific question, sir, but we will get you that.
I'd like to find out if there is a policy where there's some communication between local law enforcement and ICE here with regard to civil injunctions against individuals like this. Can you make me aware of that? And if not, advise some kind of remedy
Yes.
for that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I see my time has expired. Just mention one thing quickly, ports of entry staffing. That's when we've committed to, 2,000 new agents on the border, Customs and Border Protection, or the blue uniforms, CBP officers. We've got to make sure that they're hiring. I hear that that's going more slowly than we thought that it should. Is there any plan to speed that up, to make sure that we have the staffing? We've got better infrastructure there now. We just got to make sure the staffing levels are there.
The answer to your question is yes.
Thank
There
you.
is a plan to speed it up.
Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Johnson. Good to see you. First of all, let me thank you for your work on immigration enforcement and express my regret that we could not pass the bipartisan immigration reform bill through Congress entirely. That would have, I think, made your job a lot clearer and simpler, and significant responsibility for the immigration mess that we're in now lies with Congress, not with you, and with Congress for failing to pass the Senate's bipartisan bill, which I was a strong supporter of.
I would like to talk with you about cyber security. The Majority Leader has announced that he's going to try to have Cyber Week here on the Senate floor at some point. There's a lot of activity in the House. We have bipartisan bills that are pending on information sharing between federal agencies and the big communications providers, on agency public reporting of the cyber threat to increase public awareness, of coordinating national notification when companies have data breaches, and on updating some of the criminal penalties. When we first were working on comprehensive cybersecurity legislation, another main piece of this effort was on the critical infrastructure piece. Now, what I hear quite widely is that the DHS-led framework process that has pulled together a great number of critical infrastructure industry sectors is going very well, and that as a result of that, there is no immediate pressure for legislation in that area. Now, there may not be an immediate need for legislation in that area, but of all the different areas that I mentioned where there will be legislation, protecting our privately owned critical infrastructure is probably the most significant national security element. So I'm interested in getting your assessment of how that framework process is going and when you think it might be appropriate for Congress to begin looking at legislating in that area. I expect that the executive process will yield recommendations as to what should be done next, and I don't know what time frame you feel you are on towards that goal.
Senator, as I'm sure you know, the framework process was in lieu of any effort to legislate. I share your assessment of what you're hearing, that the framework process has been going well. It's been well received in the private sector, and it seems to be working pretty well. I also want to applaud those in Congress who were active in cybersecurity legislation. I am largely very supportive of the bill that passed the House last week, sponsored by Chairman McCall and others. I think that, frankly, some legislation is better than no legislation, and I think that information sharing between the private sector and the government is crucial. Any efforts by the Congress to promote and endorse that is crucial. I also believe that a form of immunity, limitations from civil and criminal liability for those who share cyber threat indicators with the department is crucial, and I believe that a national data breach notification requirement is also very important, and I'm pleased that we are active legislatively in those areas. In terms
that
of your
leaves us with critical infrastructure.
In terms of your precise question, I haven't thought about it the way you've asked it. I think it's a thoughtful question worthy of a thoughtful answer. Let me consult. I'd like to consult my NPPD community and get you a thoughtful answer to that.
Okay. I do think that there's a bipartisan sense that the framework process run by DHS has been effective, has achieved significant national security goals, and has enjoyed the support and cooperation of the private sector. So all of that is the good news part. The question is it enough? And is there a time when really implementing on it will require action from Congress? And how far out you see that coming? Because obviously, when it's as important as the protection of critical infrastructure, we want to be able to act pretty rapidly. And so being prepared, if it's going to be next year, there's a lot of conversation that has to take place on this issue. Again, very strong bipartisan support, but it's not an easy one. And So a preview of coming attractions would be very good. My second question is in the same area, and I'd like to ask you and maybe even urge you to consider what the structure in the executive branch for addressing our cybersecurity concerns looks like. There's an awful lot of division and sequestration in the old sense, not the budget sense, of effort. Within the Department of Justice, it's divided into two separate sections, criminal and national security. On the investigative side, it's divided between FBI and Secret Service, with other agencies having even smaller pieces. If you look at the data, you have the NCIC, which is a very well-regarded facility. The FBI has the NCIJTF. The administration has just announced its, what are they calling it, Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. And from our side of the legislative-executive divide, this looks a lot like multiplicity and confusion. And when you consider the scope of the cyber threat, the fact that we have an agency like DEA that is dedicated exclusively to narcotics trafficking, and we have an agency like ATF that is dedicated exclusively to alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and bombs, and no specific dedication of a single agency to this rapidly emerging and very persistent and dangerous cyber threat, I just think we have more work to do to set up the administrative structure that's going to allow us to be most effective at doing this. And I'd urge you to consider that and to work with OMB and DOJ to try to think 5 years ahead. Every 6 months, Mr. Secretary, there's a new wrinkle in the administrative process for doing this, and some new announcement is being made about some new agency or some new feature. And I think we need a long-term strategy, and I don't think we have it.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I would share that concern, and I know, as you know, the Defense Department is conducting a major review of their cybersecurity vulnerabilities. We're going to have to spend a lot of money on that, but it goes throughout the entire government. And the more we coordinate our effort to learn how to technologically protect our systems, I think we save money and make America a safer place. So thank you for raising that.
Mr. Chairman, to echo your point, I mean, on the military side, they have Cyber Command, and they really have set up, you know, with 2 4-stars on the top of it, a very coherent administrative structure for taking the cyber issue and making sure that it's addressed in a direct and comprehensive way. If you take that clarity of structure in the military side and you move it over and try to apply it to law enforcement, it's very scattered. And I know there are lots of turf issues and all that kind of stuff, but it just doesn't look like we've got it right yet. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Chairman, may I comment, please?
Yes, briefly, and then we'll go to Senator Perdue.
I understand. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to the Senator's questions. As the former lawyer for the United States military, I think that it's the first time I've ever heard anyone refer to the DoD structure as having clarity of structure. That's pretty good news.
On cyber, it does.
Senator, I look at it this way. The Department of Homeland Security, and specifically our NCIC, is intended to be the interface, the primary interface of the federal government with the private sector. Now, we have, as I think your question implies, a number of different law enforcement agencies involved in investigating cyber crime, and a number of different agencies, including DOD, NSA, Cyber Command, dealing with cybersecurity generally, offensively and defensively. So I came into office and I looked at all of that, much the same way you look at it, and what I have committed to do with my cybersecurity counterparts is, and I know them well, I've known Jim Comey for 26 years. I know Mike Rogers because he used to be my client. I know Jack Lew. The Commerce Department wants a piece of this too. And so I have committed to my workforce and to them that we're going to meet regularly, we're going to work together, because we don't want turf wars. Turf wars are counterproductive and they don't serve anybody's interests, most of all the American public's. So I believe that we can and we should and we are working more effectively better and without the turf battles. A lot of it, frankly, is due to personalities. And so if you have people at the top of these agencies who know each other and trust each other and work well together, we can minimize the confusion and the inconsistency. But I do recognize that there are a lot of agencies involved in cybersecurity.
Thank you. Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I just want to say for the record how much I appreciate your forbearance and courtesy earlier in our private meetings and for your public service. It's a very difficult mission you've been given. In the spirit of oversight, I'd just like to ask a couple questions. Your predecessor, Secretary Napolitano, in 2013, talked about visa overstays, and a big part of or a large percentage of illegal immigrants in this country came in this country legally and just overstayed their visa. Can you give us an update on that report? I think you mentioned something about this about a year ago as well. Can you just give us an update on that report?
I saw a preliminary report a while ago, which in my judgment lacked fidelity, to be quite honest. And so I told my people I wanted them to go back and look hard at this issue, and even if it means consulting people on the outside, let's give our best estimate at visa overstays. The work I've seen so far has not been satisfactory, such that I'm prepared to give it to the Congress or to give it to the American public as something that I'm prepared to stand behind. Yeah. So, unfortunately, and I know this has taken some time, it continues to be a work in progress, but I do want to get to the right answer.
I appreciate that. Can you give us a sense of when we might expect to see that?
I ask that exact same question of my people routinely, and I'm told that we're getting closer.
I'll take that to be months and not years. Is that
yes,
reasonable?
Sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Without getting into politics, and again, in the spirit of oversight, going back to this case in Texas on the immigration issue, the executive amnesty issue, there's a conflict between the injunction the judge put on that and the actions of the DHS and mainly the comments of the president. Can you comment, given that the president seemed to indicate that he was interested in being prepared, and that there were some 100,000 renewals done, I think, in the first 3 weeks that upset the judge. He made a comment. The president responded. Can you just give us some clarity about what exactly the DHS is doing now in relation to that case and being prepared for the outcome?
Well, in reaction to the injunction, which has not been stayed, we have shut down our implementation of the DAPA program and the expanded DACA program. We did that very, very soon after the injunction became known to us. So we're in compliance with the court order, and the things that we were trying to put in place, that we were putting in place, will either be discontinued or they will be diverted to some other use that we have, principally within CIS. But we're complying with the court's injunction because we have to. There's no stay.
So there's no ongoing preparation for what you were doing originally or what we're planning to do originally under the original guidance?
No, the implementation of the program, which had begun after November 20, we've had to suspend.
I see. Let me go back to the gang member issue, and I just want to ask about a recent decision of the Fourth Circuit that involved removing gang members under the INA. I'm sure that, well, in that case, individual gang membership may constitute a protected characteristic that can entitle the individual to relief from removal or entitle them to asylum. Basically, the rationale is like if you're an MS-13, for example, you might be in danger in your home country if you claim that you renounced your gang membership, you turn state's evidence, and now you can't go back. I think it's pretty obviously that we could be set up for significant fraud there. How do you interpret, that ruling by the Fourth Circuit, and has it changed any of the procedures ongoing in DHS?
Senator, I have to confess I'm not familiar with that Fourth Circuit decision.
Okay.
Let me, if you don't mind, let me take that question for the record for you.
Sure, that'll be great. We'll submit it in writing. That would be great. I would appreciate that. Last, can you give us an idea of how you go about estimating the number of people that cross our southern border? I mean, I know there is no accurate number, and I know it was asked earlier today, but is there an attempt? I know we have this big number called illegal immigrants that we're monitoring. We've got this study you're working on visa overstays. But in terms of the people that come in illegally, what are we doing in DHS to sort of quantify that so you know how to deploy resources? And this is, again, just an oversight, not a political question.
We have apprehensions, which in the judgment of the professionals is an indicator of total attempts to cross the border. And so the report I issued last week talked about apprehensions. There is an attempt also to measure what the Border Patrol calls turnbacks and getaways. And that number is one that I think we can do a better job of trying to quantify so that we get to total attempts to cross the border. I'm interested in getting to that number. And so I've consulted with outside experts, I've consulted with my own people about arriving at a way to measure total attempts. And there are various ideas out there, some of which are published. The Council on Foreign Relations has done some good work in this area, which includes surveys of people south of the border and what their behavior might be. And so I'm interested in more transparency in this and more clarity when it comes to total attempts to cross the border. It is not an easy exercise. And there is a certain unknown factor when it comes to people who evade capture, who evade apprehension. And so I'm interested in getting to a better, clearer measurement of that. I agree with the sentiment of your question.
When you get
but
that
in the
information,
absence of that, total apprehensions I take as an indicator of total attempts to cross the border.
well,
So
I
that's
appreciate
something
your
I'm talking
approach.
about.
I appreciate your quantitative approach. When you get that information, would you share it with us at the appropriate time? We'll put that in a written record question as well. And again, thank you for your service. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
Thank you. Senator Perdue, here's an article on March from I believe the Washington Times. Maybe not. It said, talking about a House hearing on this question, a Border Patrol agent, while testifying before actually it was the Homeland Security panel, Senator Johnson's committee, indicated that nearly 6 out of every 10 aliens who attempt to infiltrate the United States through the U.S.-Mexico border are not apprehended. That's his estimate. He went on to say, ask any line agent in the field, and he or she will tell you at best we apprehend 35 to 40% of the illegal immigrants attempting to cross. This number is even lower for drug smugglers who are much more adept at eluding capture. He said, quote, agents who repeatedly report groups larger than 20 face retribution. Management will either take them out of the field and assign them to processing detainees at the station or assign them to a fixed position in low-volume areas as punishment, Cabrera told the lawmakers. Needless to say, agents got the message and now stay below this 20-person threshold no matter the actual size of the group. Mr. Johnson, you're the head person of this entity. Have you investigated this charge about agents being told not to have more than 20, to report more than 20 if they see more than 20?
I've heard of that allegation. I've heard of that charge. I've looked into it. I don't have a specific answer to that suggestion. I will say this, Senator. I think that 6 out of 10 is too high an estimate, and I base that on my own conversations with Border Patrol experts. I will also tell you this, sir. I spend a lot of time myself on the southern border with our men and women in uniform in the Border Patrol because I want to hear directly from them what they say is happening on the southern border. I'm not interested in intermediaries.
Well, have you
So-
met with Chris Crane, the head of the ICE Association?
And I've met with Mr. Crane, too.
How many times?
At least once in my headquarters office. I invited him to come in, and I believe there was probably at least one other time as well.
What about Mr. Palinkas of the USCIS? Have you met with him?
I don't recall that name.
Yeah,
It's
the
entirely possible.
association. Well, these are the top people, and you've got the lowest morale in the government in your agency. And the reason is because they know you're not serious about supporting them in the mission that they've been given. They filed a lawsuit against Secretary Napolitano asserting that they're being required not to follow the law. So look, we've got a problem. I know I'd like to have a nice conversation here, but this administration has been systematically seeking not to see the laws enforced. They're focusing more and more on ameliorating the concerns of people who enter the country illegally than they are on people who that come lawfully. He also said this, Mr. Cabrera did in his testimony, I want to be crystal clear, the border is not secure. How can this enormous gap exist between what you, DHS, tells you here in Washington and what our agents know to be the truth in the field? Frankly, it is how you manipulate statistics, close quote. And I think statistics are manipulated. You're saying we have more removals and big increase in removals, but you started counting, I believe before you took office, Mr. Napolitano, started counting the turnarounds at the border as removals. They would never been considered that before. Without those, you haven't had an increase in removals. In fact, you have a significant decline. I think you've acknowledged, have you not, that that counting is a new system of accounting that counts the apprehensions at the border as removals. You admitted that or acknowledged that to Mr. Culberson, the House member, in a House committee meeting.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir.
Well,
but I
he asked you this. More than half of those removals, I'm quoting Representative Culberson, were attributed to ICE, that are attributed to ICE are actually a result of Border Patrol arrests that wouldn't have been counted in prior administrations. Mr. Johnson, correct? That was
Sir,
your
I have learned from 30 years of cross-examining witnesses that if I'm to answer such a question, I think I want to see the Q&A before and after.
Well, look,
don't mind,
isn't it
sir.
the truth? Haven't y'all been, isn't it a new thing in recent years to start counting both, or you don't know?
Sir, I do know this.
You're the secretary. You should know that you changed the standards. Here, I've got a chart here somewhere that showed the actual numbers. Actual removals on the ICE chart show Border Patrol numbers along with ICE. That increases the numbers. It's about 300,000. Only 100,000 are what were classically called removals previously.
May I read you something? This is one of
Yes?
my
Okay.
this is one of my directives from November 20th. If you'll just bear with me a second.
Well, the chart I just looked at was ICE chart in 2014, September 20th, 2014, when you were in office.
I've heard the suggestion of double counting, and if there's double counting, that obviously should not happen. One of my directives from November 20 is I'm directing the Office of Immigration Statistics to create the capability to collect, maintain, and report to the Secretary data reflecting the numbers of those apprehended, removed, returned, or otherwise repatriated by any component of DHS, and to report that data in accordance with the priorities set forth above. I want our components to cooperate with this effort. I intend for this data to be part of the package of data released by DHS to the public annually.
Okay,
So I'm
well,
interested in
I
getting this
appreciate that,
done
but
on
let me tell you what
just
is
right
happening.
basis.
You can call this double counting or not. Border Patrol apprehends people at the border, and they're sent back, and they count those as their numbers. ICE used to only count what they did from the interior. Now they count that plus the Border Patrol. Now, that's the fact, and that without those additional numbers, they don't show the improvement the department has been declaring. Now, with regard to streamline that you were asking about, this is really important, Mr. Secretary. Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano said Operation Streamline has proven effective. It's a program where people, when they're caught at the border, are actually prosecuted for the offense of entering the country. They are convicted of misdemeanors. They aren't kept in jail a long time, but they have a conviction on their record. That was a belief that it might deter more people from coming, and it was the right thing to do since it violates the law. In the Del Rio sector, after this was done, overall apprehensions declined from 42,000 to 17,000. In 2008, Attorney General Michael Mukasey said, quote, "The program has an unbelievable return effect. In the Yuma sector, from October through December of 2008, the Department of Justice prosecuted over 1,200 cases. As a consequence, apprehension rates dropped nearly 70%. What we see both statistically and anecdotally is that when people who cross the border illegally are brought to face the reality that they are committing a crime, even if it's just a misdemeanor, that has a huge impact on their willingness to try again and on the willingness of others to break the law coming across the borders." In fiscal year 2007, former Homeland Security Secretary Chertoff noted that apprehension rates in Yuma dropped nearly 70% after Operation Streamline. Recently, the president of the Border Patrol Union for the Yuma sector, Brent Worsenscroft, said, quote, "Operation Streamline is one of the last strongholds we have as a deterrent." So, have you talked to the Department of Justice to attempt to restore this and actually expand it? And if the number of people are coming has reduced, it would be even more effective and more practical to initiate these kind of prosecutions. You have to defend your agents. These are crimes. I think you should demand the Department of Justice prosecute them.
Senator, I speak to the Department of Justice all the time about how we are enforcing our immigration laws. I do know that our apprehension numbers are down this year in every sector, including Arizona, including Texas. And in my view, that's a good thing. And I think it's a good thing as a result of a number of different efforts, including our law enforcement efforts and our additional resources on the southern border, our efforts at public messaging, the good help we've received from the Central American governments and from the government of Mexico. In fact, our apprehension numbers are down.
Why don't you continue this program that everybody has bragged on so consistently as having a real impact, as much as 50% reduction in attempts in the sectors where Streamline is utilized? Why don't you do that? Is there some reason you don't want to do that? It used to be done.
I don't know that prosecuting every mom with a young woman, with a young child crossing the border for a federal crime is the way to go. I do believe that the more effective way to go is to focus on the smugglers, focus on the coyotes who are bringing these people across. Nobody freelances. They're all brought at the hands of a criminal smuggling organization. So I want to get at the source, and that's what we're doing.
Well, Secretary Chertoff said it dropped nearly 70%. Others have said high numbers. Even Secretary Napolitano has bragged on the program. Senator Flake on the border, his predecessor, Senator Kyle, thought this was one of the most effective things that's ever been done on the border. And you allowed it to stop. I guess you could blame Attorney General Holder, but if you haven't complained about it, I don't see how you can blame him. I'm sorry, Senator Coons, you've arrived. Thank you, and I'll yield to you. And maybe the Secretary could respond if he'd like to. I don't mean to cut you off.
My point is this, Senator. We work with the Department of Justice all the time on the most effective and efficient way to enforce our immigration laws. What we determined to do last summer was to go after the smugglers. Everybody who crosses is paying these smugglers thousands of dollars per person to do this. They don't freelance. And so we've determined to go after the coyotes, go after the smugglers, and I think that that has made a difference, sir.
Well, I have no doubt. I don't know why you waited so long. Secretary Coons.
Thank you, Senator Sessions, and thank you, Secretary Johnson, for your service and for your testimony today, and for the chance to continue our conversation on a number of issues. Let me first start with cybersecurity as legislation is being considered. The administration, if I understand correctly, has issued a statement of policy supporting the goals of cyber information legislation, but warning that more needs to be done to protect the privacy of Americans so that the current cybersecurity bill does not become a foreign surveillance and intelligence bill. Can you expand on that and talk a little bit about how you view the Department of Homeland Security's proper role in preventing personal user information from being shared with the NSA or CIA?
Through the proper, this is a balance, through the proper screening of PII, of cyber...
Personally identifying information.
Yes,
PII.
sorry. I don't normally use acronyms. The proper screening of them, but in as near real time as possible, because we also need speed. The interagency wants and needs speed. And we're developing systems now that can screen out the personal identifiers while getting the information our interagency partners need. I also know that cyber threat indicators, which is what we're most interested in, rarely have what you and I would consider personal identifiers in them. But if they do, they should be screened out. So we're working on getting both the speed and limiting the dissemination of personal identifiers from the agencies that should not get them. And so that's a project that I'm focused on, irrespective of whether or not Congress acts on legislation, but I really hope that you do.
And does the agency currently have the resources to do both of those, to screen out all the personally identifying information and share appropriately?
We're on a project right now at the NKIC to promote exactly that and get us in a better place on exactly that.
That's encouraging, and I appreciate your ongoing focus on privacy as a critical component of our security. When you were last before our committee, June of last year, we discussed 3 topics specific to immigration and due process, where I would like an update on where we are so far. First, you recognize the legitimate law enforcement concerns around enforcement actions happening near courthouses. Immigration enforcement at or near a courthouse undermines public safety and impedes access to justice by sending the message that going to court is dangerous for those who might be here in an undocumented status because it can lead to deportation. Has the department clarified its procedures on courthouse enforcement?
Yes, we have a policy. I confess I haven't looked at it in a while, but I know that ICE considers a courthouse to be, and I'm not going to get the words exactly right, protected space or a special place. There are, and I believe there should be, exceptions for genuine public safety threats, but we do have a policy.
We also discussed...
I can get you the exact policy, but we do have a policy.
I would appreciate some follow-up on that if we could, Mr. Secretary. We also discussed nighttime and lateral repatriation. And you said you were working with the Mexican government on this and acknowledged the DHS policy since 2004 has been against the needless separation of families. And I wondered if DHS had ceased the practices of lateral and nighttime deportations and repatriation.
As a result of discussions that I had with the Mexican government last year, we now have a steering committee in place between the U.S. and the Mexican governments to better coordinate repatriations to designated places at designated hours. We do not have a policy of separating families. I don't think that's a good idea. I want to discourage that. We do not have, that is not part of our policy. Can I envision an exception or two for logistics reasons? Yes. But since last year, we have moved away from night repatriations, and we're working now with the Mexican government much more effectively at identifying for them when we return people, logistically working with them to do so in a more controlled way.
Thank you. And a third area in this general topic, we discussed previously providing what are called the A files to immigrants facing deportation so they don't have to spend time going through the FOIA process. You said you would look into that, and I didn't know whether DHS had begun to routinely provide A files to aliens in deportation proceedings, something that we had agreed in that previous exchange about it would be, frankly, in the interest of justice and reduce the time and cost of deportation proceedings.
I do know we now have a policy on that. We also have a policy concerning congressional requests for A files. Sitting here, maybe this is because I've been here a while, but sitting here,
I recognize I am the last question, Mr. Secretary.
I can't remember exactly what the policy is, so let me get you that for the record.
Please do. I'd appreciate both follow-up and some clarity about what the department needs to get us to a place where you're following what I think is the appropriate process here. Okay. Let me move to U.S. versus Texas and the executive actions. I'd like to get your response to some of the facts.
That one I haven't forgotten about.
I suspect you haven't. You may have had some vigorous exchanges on that. I just wanted your response to the factual findings and legal conclusions the Texas judge made in blocking temporarily your efforts to use prosecutorial discretion to enforce our law more sensibly, efficiently, and justly. The court ruled your directives would have foreclosed DHS discretion to adjudicate each case on its merits. Did your directives actually foreclose your discretion, and what about that of DHS employees?
As I noted earlier, in at least two places, Judge Hainan said in his opinion that the discretion of the Secretary to decide how to devote his resources, where to focus his resources, should be unquestioned. He did say that. As part of, and the district judge seems to believe that the policy is an across-the-board, hands-off for a whole class of people. The way the new policy is set up and the way it's written, and I wrote it, it's to be a case-by-case assessment of whether somebody represents a threat to public safety, border security, national security, and in fact, there is written into the policy something that did not exist in the old policy, the DACA policy. Among the criteria for consideration by an examining officer is, in addition to, has this person been in the country 5 years, do they have a child who's a citizen or lawful permanent resident, does the applicant present any other factors that, in the exercise of discretion, makes the grant of deferred action inappropriate? That's an additional factor. So I want to encourage a case-by-case assessment of each applicant to see whether or not they are appropriate for prosecutorial discretion. And I know that there's a lot of disagreement in Congress on this committee about the appropriateness of deferred action. I think back to when I was a prosecutor. We used to enter into deferred prosecution agreements with individuals based on a case-by-case assessment. And so I think this is an extension of that. Is it a large extension? Yes. Is it a potentially large pool of people? Yes. But it is intended to be a case-by-case judgment, and I think that that's part of the inherent authority of the Secretary of the Executive Branch in the enforcement of our immigration laws.
The court also ruled that the government would not suffer any significant harm through delay, through the impact of a temporary delay in your efforts. And I just, if I might, Mr. Chairman, would be interested in your answer to what impact this delay is having on the government, on individuals who would otherwise be qualified for deferred action, on our economy. Any observations you care to make about the impact of delay?
Well, I know that there is a tremendous level of disappointment in the community. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the new program in the community. I saw it myself personally in places like Chicago, Los Angeles. And so the injunction requires us to turn in a dime and shut down all of our implementation efforts, which we have done. And I believe that this period, while the program is enjoined, could have a lasting impact on the overall success of the program, because the community is confused, there's uncertainty, there's probably anxiety about going forward with something that's an item in litigation. So I think it has created a significant setback to the overall success of the program, and it's as long as the injunction's in place, a huge uncertainty overhanging CIS's operations and ability to function. The stay application is, I believe, last time I looked, still pending with the Fifth Circuit, and we'll see how they rule.
Would the chairman suffer through one more quick question? As we've discussed before, DHS assistance to state and local law enforcement is critical to our work together to combat terrorism and extremism, to keep our communities safe. I just wondered if you thought there were any areas where you believed DHS assistance and support to state and local law enforcement was deserving of our particular attention, and I want to thank the chairman for his indulgence of my last question.
I think that cooperation, information sharing with state and local law enforcement, given how the global terrorist threat is evolving, is becoming more and more important. I mean, I think it's key that because of the threat of the independent actor, the so-called lone wolf, who is not somebody that our intelligence community will necessarily detect overseas, it's crucial that cops on the ground and local law enforcement see what we see in terms of potential terrorist threats to our country. We issue almost on a weekly basis now joint intelligence bulletins to local law enforcement. We issued a pretty significant one last week. I was just with the Commissioner of Police of the City of Boston yesterday talking about this exact issue, and I think it's got to be the wave of the future in terms of partnering with state and local police, law enforcement.
Well, I appreciate your attention to that. I thank you for your answer, and I thank the chairman's forbearance for that question. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Coons, the 9/11 Commission issued a number of recommendations after that terrible day when they did their report. One of them was that we have a biometric entry-exit system. We've had that in law since 2002. It is not in effect today. If you do an iPad or iPhone, you just put your fingerprint on it, it reads it. So it's very practical for a person coming in an airport to put their finger on. They have a visa for a certain number of days, and when they exit, they should go out and put their hand on it and clocked out. So the exit visa has never been done. Just and the 9/11 Commission says there's no way you can have control over visas if you don't do that, which is plainly true. And so we've discussed it for years. It's a requirement of law, and it can be done. When can we expect it to be done, Mr. Secretary?
Well, as I'm sure you know, Senator, we have biometric entry now for large classes of travelers. I'd like to see us have biometric exit because I agree with you. I think it promotes security. I think it is a good thing to have. I know it's a 9/11 Commission recommendation, and it also involves a huge commitment in terms of resources to have this.
Let me ask you, so the 9/11 Commission follow-up report criticized the government. One of the most severe criticisms was not implementing what they recommended a decade ago. Have you asked the Congress for any money? Have you laid out a plan on what it would take to have an exit system and ask for the resources to get it done?
I believe that we have at some point, and it's something that I would like to see get done.
Well, I would hope you would send that. We'll review the record, and I definitely think so, that we should do that, and I'm glad you would agree. With regard to the sanctuary city problem, we've got major cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, refusing to honor federal detainers on people who are in the country unlawfully, just saying we don't apparently have any desire whatsoever to support the government in having an effective immigration system, and in fact, we're going to sabotage it. Do you think that, would you support legislation that would clarify ICE detainers and make them mandatory?
I don't believe that a federal requirement that the local sheriff or police chief respond affirmatively to a detainer from the federal government is the appropriate way to go. I do agree with the spirit of your question, and that is why we have undertaken a very aggressive effort to work with Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, where I was last week, state of California, where I was last week, on this exact issue, because one of the reasons I think that we are having difficulty getting at the criminals is because of a lot of jurisdictions who are putting barriers on their ability to cooperate with us. So I want to remove that.
I think it's an unbelievable affront to law. It's an actual assertion that they're going to sabotage law enforcement in their cities. And not only do they have a different view about immigration, they're going to sabotage the enforcement of plain law. Now, your ICE director, former prosecutor, Sarah Saldana, when asked about the same question I asked you, if they shouldn't be made mandatory on these cities, and she replied, "Thank you, amen, yes." So I understand after that she was apparently counseled, and she issued a retraction of that. So was that your discussion with her? Did you direct that she should back off that position?
No, I wouldn't characterize it that way. She did issue a written statement the next day correcting her statement, which I believe accurately and honestly reflects her own views. I know Miss Saldana well enough to know that I'm not going to be able to get her to say something she doesn't believe.
Well, she works for you.
Yes. And
agents are saying what and doing what you tell them to do, even if it's in violation of law. What about this problem of countries that won't accept repatriation or return of people who came illegally? Senator Specter had legislation on that. His basic view was, and which I think you have the power to do now, but would be mandatory, was if a country does not take back people who entered the United States unlawfully, that they don't get to have any more admissions. And that'll send them a message, and that'll end it. So we've been dealing with China, I think, is our number one problem, the biggest problem.
That was my exact conversation with the Chinese 3 weeks ago.
I know that. And I know you perhaps made a little progress. But the memorandum of understanding, even with China, seems to do little to actually fix this problem. It essentially only provides 2 individuals from the Chinese government to assist with repatriation efforts that involve tens of thousands of Chinese nationals. Congress has provided a mechanism already in law, Section 243D of the Immigration Nationality Act. It permits you to notify the Secretary of State of China or other countries, and there are others, and in turn requires the Secretary of State of the United States to stop granting visas to citizens and nationals of such countries. Have you made any notification to any country that you intend to execute such a plan if they don't accept back the individuals who are to be deported?
Well, I do believe that we and the State Department need to get with these countries and point out to them that they're slow in taking back the people we need to repatriate to them. And we have undertaken a campaign to do exactly that. I don't necessarily believe that we ought to suspend immigration travel from any of these countries because of this particular issue. I think that that is probably not the best way to go.
Well, why don't they take them back, Mr.
Senator,
Secretary?
I have had some very blunt conversations with my Chinese counterparts about this exact issue in Beijing when I was there 3 weeks ago, for example.
Forgive me, if I don't think you're going to have a big progress with China. I hope I'm wrong. It's happening, and it's been going on for a decade or more. And people sitting in your chair have failed to execute and use the powers they have. All you have to do is tell China, if you want further immigration to America, you're going to have to take back these individuals, because it costs us a lot of money, either to keep them in detention, keep them taken care of, their medical needs, or we release them on bail and they disappear into the country and nobody's able to find them or deport them. It's just an unacceptable thing. It's just a part of international immigration policy that if an individual from a country comes to the United States unlawfully, they should be able to be deported. With regard to the 287G program, it trains local law enforcement to determine whether an individual they come up against, maybe within the prison system, is what Alabama did, to find out if they're here unlawfully, to do it in a legal and constitutional way, to be cooperative with the federal government. It was a good program. It was expanded and executed. But ICE touted it as a big success. But they've removed this language from their website. Since January 2006, the 287G program is credited with identifying more than 304,000 potentially removable aliens, mostly at local jails. ICE has trained and certified more than 1,300 state local law officers to help enforce immigration law. But in last October, an ICE spokesman said this: the 287G program expand ICE's ability to initiate immigration enforcement actions against criminal aliens and those who fall within the ICE civil immigration enforcement priorities. As such, the program acts as a force multiplier for the agency and enhances public safety in participating jurisdictions by identifying potentially dangerous criminal aliens and ensuring they are removed from the United States and not released back into their communities. By the way, there was just a news report from Madison County, Huntsville area, saw Prosecutor Broussard, an illegal alien had been convicted of murdering a police officer. He was on the ground, helpless, pleading for his life, and he murdered him. He committed suicide in prison. But I just would say we've got to be, if we really want to reduce those kind of incidents from happening, then we've got to use the tools that we have. So, but this administration, nevertheless, has systematically dismantled the 287G program, canceling agreements with law enforcement and slashing funding for the program, largely because the amnesty advocates oppose it. They don't like it. And we have far too much action on behalf of this president and the Secretary of Homeland Security responding to advocates for illegal immigration than serving the lawful interests of the people of the United States. It just is. So today only 35 programs are existing. That's less than half of what it was. It should have been expanded. So tell me, do you believe it's a good program? Should it be expanded, or do you want to continue to see it wither on the vine?
I believe the 287G program is a good program in many respects. The biggest problem we have, Senator, in terms of our ability to work with local law enforcement in removing criminal immigrants was the Secure Communities Program. 239 jurisdictions, I think I got that number right, were refusing to work with us or were imposing limitations on the ability to work with us. That's a big problem. So we ended the Secure Communities Program and we've replaced it with a new program that I believe resolves the political and legal controversy, and it takes two to dance. So I'm now out there meeting with a lot of sheriffs, a lot of police chiefs, a lot of governors, and a lot of mayors to introduce them to the new program so that they will work with us again on immigration enforcement.
Well, I just talked to some sheriffs, and they're very willing to help. They're very critical of Homeland Security and the federal government for not protecting their communities. And even though some cities may refuse, others, no doubt, would be willing to participate, and sheriff's departments would. So, Mr. Secretary, just the whole tenor of this, if anybody understands what's happening, indicates that you're not demonstrating a will to see the law be enforced. And if you will do that effectively, and if you'll send a clear message and utilize the tools that you have, instead of undermining the tools that you have, I believe we could have a dramatic improvement in the number of people who attempt to enter unlawfully. We could reduce dramatically visa overstays at very little cost. And once the message gets out that you're not going to be able to come to the United States unlawfully, fewer and fewer people will attempt to come. So
that's in fact what's happening, sir.
Well, you are having a reduction, it appears, at the border. We don't know how much. This agent says more than, for everyone apprehended, more than that gets by, particularly the drug smugglers. But so be it. We're going to have another surge, according to your own agents, this summer from Central America, it appears. So I would like to see. I don't think I'm being unfair about this. I've watched this for a long time, and I don't think I'm being unfair. This president has been focused on reducing the activities and lawful jurisdiction of your agents. Their morale is in the tank. They are not happy with what's going on, and the American people shouldn't either. And I think we should be stronger on secure communities. I believe, Mr. Secretary, you're right. That's a good program. And I don't understand. It's almost to me like they don't understand it or just refuse to participate in it. To take a fingerprints from somebody who's in the country unlawfully and send it to Homeland Security, maybe you would identify someone who has a particularly violent history, or maybe you'll identify where they are, and in the future, if they're arrested again at the border, you'd have information in that data. We do it for normal criminals. So I support you on that. I think you should not have backed down on it. I think it's a very reasonable thing. So I'll let you wrap up in any way you would like, and the record will remain open for 1 week for additional questions.
Thank you, Senator. And I do want to say something in conclusion. I have discovered that as the leader of an organization of 225,000 people, one of the ways to ensure that we continue low morale is to continue to say publicly to my workforce, you have low morale. And so the other week, there was a subcommittee on the House side that wanted to have another hearing on low morale within DHS. And they called one of my people as a witness, and they got a visit from me. And I said, please stop telling my workforce you have low morale. I don't believe that. I think that there are a lot of good people in DHS that are very dedicated to their mission at the airports, at the ports, at the border. I've seen it myself. They work overtime for public safety, for border security, for aviation security. I visited with a woman in New Orleans who was almost killed by a deranged man who was shot in the arm and came to work the next day. That's the level of her dedication in our department. We are on an aggressive campaign to improve the experience of people in my workforce, more transparency in hiring, promotions, mentoring experiences. I'm thanking people for their work. We brought back our Secretary's Award ceremony. But those who keep telling my workforce that you have low morale are not helping, frankly. And I want to improve things within the department. I want to make it a better, more efficient, effective place. I know you share that view, Senator. And so I'm on an aggressive campaign to improve how our workforce thinks about their very, very important mission. And I'm hoping I get the support of Congress in that.
Well,
One of the things we're doing,
I don't
for
think
example,
it's,
is pay reform for immigration enforcement personnel. That's something I need Congress's help on, because one of the things I hear from them is we're capped at GS9. We need a pay raise. I want to get them a pay raise. We've reformed pay for overtime for our Border Patrol agents, and we want to do more of that. So I'm looking for the support of Congress on that.
Look, it was before your time. I raised the question with Secretary Napolitano over a series of years. I asked her, for example, had she even met with Chris Crane, the head of the Immigration Customs Enforcement Officers Association. She'd never met with him. I asked her every time she came before the committee, and she refused to meet with him. And their problem has not been pay, although I'm sure they'd like to have more pay. Their fundamental problem has been they're not being supported. If they actually enforce the law and do what the law says, they're told by their supervisors not to do so. You've got this officer under oath before a committee recently in the Senate saying that they're told not to report groups of 20 or more people. That's the kind of I've been hearing for years before you came. So I suggest that you need to be listening to their agents and get on their side and try to help them fulfill their legal obligation and your obligation. Instead, we're being led by a president who's unlawfully giving amnesty to people who entered the country by the millions, entered it illegally. Well, that's where we are. So thank you for
Senator,
testimony. I'll let you reply again.
I've met with Chris Crane, but more importantly, I've met with hundreds of people that he represents who are on the border, who work for me. And I consider that to be a fundamental part of my job as the leader of this organization.
Well, you know, I indicated to you when you came it was going to be a difficult job. I believe what I shared with you was you're not going to be allowed to do what you're supposed to do. If you take this job, this president does not want to see the immigration laws enforced. That's what's happened. The officers know it. Everybody that studies it realizes that you're not moving aggressively to help them end the illegal immigration. And as a result, we've got this difficult problem out there. You're a good man. You've got good abilities. I do believe you care about your officers, and you are right. We have a lot of fine, talented people. There's just a level of frustration out there that I hope you'll spend some time listening to and see if you can't respond to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. We'll dismiss.